Hello and welcome, everybody. It is I, DH Thorne, with coming at you live tonight. We're going to be having an interesting conversation with my very special guest, Dan Updike of TDP. We just did a show the other day together talking about interesting things. We were talking about especially sincerity and honesty and all those things in the arts. Dan is here with a green screen tonight, literally, and he's something of an expert on Norse magic and mythology and things. So I invited him on tonight to talk about some of those things, among other things. We're not going to limit ourselves. So why don't you say hi, Dan? Introduce yourself to the audience, and we'll get going once people pour in a little bit more.
Well, thank you for having me on, DH. Yes, you got the green screen behind, of course, because I don't use Windows, and whatever software that I use doesn't like Skype. Everybody knows, like we were saying just before we came on the air here, everybody knows I broadcast from a glorified closet. So there's a green screen there. But of course, my name is Dan, and I started out actually with a audio podcast called Northern Runes Radio, or the NRR, and then that evolved into the TDP videocast. And so it's just been something that started from a concept and experience with the Northern tradition, which of course is talking about runes and the Northern mythologies and the histories of the peoples of Northern Europe. And it evolved into something that was a lot more inclusive to everything that is out there, the transcendent principles that are behind all magical systems. And so it's something that I've always been doing over the last 36, 37 years. And it's important to my heart to never forget what actually inspired me on this journey. And that was, of course, the runes. And so I'm excited to be here, and we'll talk about lots of things, I'm sure. But
yeah, I think we're gonna cover a whole bunch of stuff, because there's been a lot on my mind lately. Obviously, the world, which you are a bit of a student of as well. I mean, I have a lot of people come on here. We do talk about current events. I don't know if that's what you want to do, but that does come up. But also, a lot of that's relevant. It's one of those things that I think a lot of people are shying away from, and that is not what our ancestors would have done. Our ancestors would have been absolutely involved. They wouldn't have, obviously you got a bunch of farmers that just go, well, I hope the new overlord doesn't kill us all. But back in the ages when men were more free, I suppose, men and women were more free, it was everybody's concern, what was going on, and people would take it very seriously. And I think that's something that may play a role in what we're talking about a little bit, at least somewhat, because especially people on the Norse tradition see the gods as ancestors. So they're part of your ancestors. And would your ancestors want you just sort of, groveling and hiding and not speaking up? Or would they want you, are they going to smile when you're hiding in a hole saying, this isn't a problem, spiritual stuff doesn't talk about this stuff? Or would they want you to stand up for your families and your futures and everything else? So that might enter into it a little bit, but there's
I
a lot.
don't think we'll be able to get away from that, because what you're saying there is actually very true. The responsibility for the community was in the hands of the community. Mm-hmm. And it was actually quite dishonorable to leave that to the side, because there was so much at stake, not to just jump in here too prematurely, but to give people who may not have this understanding a little bit of a context and a picture. Imagine you lived in a place that didn't have electricity, that didn't have any type of technological convenience, where what the food stores held from the summer's harvest and the fall's harvest, sometimes they had bumper crops depending on where they were, and from the hunts and so forth, that was what was going to keep the family alive through the winter. And so many different things could affect that. And so it was about survival. Now, today we live in a rather insulated society. It's an artificial society in a sense that's kind of separate from nature in its expression. Nothing, as you know, DH, is actually separate from nature, but
Correct.
we like to pretend that it is.
It sure makes us feel big, doesn't it? When we get to say, oh, we have this synthetic fake world. It's not real nature. Everything you do is part of nature. The question is how much of it is, well, you know, there's everything's got an organic, natural flow to it. The question is, how much of that do we take credit for egoistically, and what effect does that have on what we do? You know, and like you said, I don't want to split too many hairs. It's really simple. Everything's part of nature, even the electronics in our life. It's just a question of, is it nature that is holistically resonant with what nature normally does, or is it something that you know, is going to be detrimental to us? And is that nature too? Of course it is. You know, nature, part of nature is extinction. Okay, people can't forget that part of nature is extinction. So that's Ragnarok, I suppose one could say. That's built into the philosophy of the Norse as well. So we'll talk about everything. We're going to just talk about all of it. First, let's say hi to some people. Wyatt, I'm gonna put you on slow mode, bro. You get like 30 messages. What's going on, man?
I wish I could type that fast.
I mean, I'm not even sure he did. I think he just was bored waiting. He's a good kid, though. All right. Sido says hello, and Gage the Mage says hello, and Gogo says, DH Thorne, hi legend, how are you? Skeleton Power says hail with a fist bump. Well, actually, I think it's supposed to be the horns. Kelly Meadow says hello and good evening. Hello, Kelly. It's good talking to you. Check out that thing that we talked about. Prince of Gygal says, hail, friends, with a scorpion. J3 Gothic says, hi. Audacity says, guess my light has burned too bright of late. I suppose that's possible. Yeah. Sartorius Occult, European spiritual heritage with an exclamation point. Indeed. You know, before I get into the more hellos, how about that message I sent you with that person clearly racist or whatever? Like if you check their personal wall, it was a very racist minded person who mocked the post that I put up talking about this as something, because look, there's a lot of native European things. You got Celtics, you know, the Celts. You've got even the Mediterranean stuff that still counts as part of Europe, and you have the Norse and the Germanic, and you can go further east to the Slavic, and even, you know, you get to that whole Indo-European stuff that's all part of, you know, Proto-Indo-European especially, that's part of European Western history. So there's this idea that like white people don't have a spiritual heritage, you know, is asinine. I don't know who came up with this idea that we just have Christianity or Romans or something like that. Like it doesn't, and I don't want to get into the race element because that's a construct. It's nonsense. But this idea that people, because of a certain shade, can't be spiritual or something is ridiculous. And our own, to my understanding, which is, you know, novice at best, it's quite comparable to what we see in other indigenous peoples around the world. In fact, some things are actually almost if you change the, you know, some of the cultural metaphors, they're almost identical in terms of in terms of what is done. You know, even I watched a video by a guy who's talking about like smudging, that like, yeah, they didn't have the same kind of smudging, but they definitely use smoke and sacred herbs in much the same way, you know, for cleansing. So hopefully we'll talk about a lot of that.
One thing that I want to put out there that is just from what you were just saying, DH, ancestor reverence.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that was very important to the ancient Northern European tribes, and I'm talking about pre-Christian. Okay, so we're looking at before the conversion, before all of the things that happened in Europe from that period. Ancestor reverence was vitally important. If you take a look in the Far East, whether it's India, the Koreas, both North and South, China, Japan, what do you find? Ancestor reverence. If you go to the North American native peoples, what do you find? Ancestor reverence. Mm-hmm. You find common themes that are there. And, you know,
when you go to ancient Sumeria and Egypt, yeah. it was all, it's like you can't get away from it. It's like only, I don't know, only us weird Western Christians kind of drop that ball. It seems like everybody else does it, right?
Mm-hmm. So, long story short, we have a lot more in common across the human race than we have as differences.
Yeah.
And so, just to bear that in mind and realize, to quote the Tao Te Ching, there is only the Tao.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, I agree with that.
Yeah, and that's nature. Like, that's another way of saying nature. That's the will of the divine, one could say.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of different synonymous ways of describing, and I do love the word Tao. I use it all the time, in fact, when I'm trying to explain things to people. Think of the Tao as the will of the divine, and the will of the divine as the Tao, and it is inevitable. It is what it is, and it will do what it does. And one of the most important things to realize is that it's purposelessness, right? And not because it doesn't follow a flow that seems to have a before and after and a blah, 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 but because the divine cannot be caused. This is a very subtle idea that a lot of people don't think about. The divine can't be caused. And purpose is part of, you need to be caused to have a purpose. In other words, there has to be something causing you to do anything for you to have a purpose. So if I were to say, what is the purpose of this lighter? Okay. Well, where does the purpose for this lighter come from? Because I have a need to make fire. So there's a cause and effect in motion. I am commanding this lighter to make fire, if you will. That is why it has a purpose. But the divine, there is nothing in lordship over it, nothing commanding the divine. So therefore, it is purposelessness. It has no purpose whatsoever. It does as it will, inevitably what it will. So this is where mysticism steps in, and we see this, I think, everywhere. I might be using the wrong term. Is it the weird, or is it something in Norse mythology would be resonant with the Tao? If
that would be weird. Spelled W-Y-R-D.
Right.
And actually, if you think about it, a lot of people really attribute, and rightly so, a lot of complexity to the ancient Egyptian models of the afterlife, of the body and the soul complex. But the Northern tradition was almost as complex. A lot of people, just think that they were telling stories around a fire while they were busy burning and pillaging. That's not all that they did. They certainly did some of that. But so did every other group of people on the face of the earth at one point in time or other, and some still are. But the thing is that the power that was underlying it, was not something that was just mindless and random. There was a lot of thought that went into it. There was a lot of shamanic journeying that went into it. Mm-hmm. So and
it's all metaphor.
I
mean, if I can interrupt, it's all symbolic metaphor. Like when we're talking about even the Norse creation myth with the cows and the milk and the blah blah blah.
No. If anybody thinks
so much
there was
metaphor.
An actual literal cow with a giant sucking on its teats at the beginning of the universe, you need to understand metaphors.
and this applies to all ancient religions and spiritual paths. And we have modern materialistic, shallow thinking, unwise scholars who they only know books and they see things through a lens of what we know. And they look back in time at like the Greeks and think of them as these really kind of foolish people who had superstitions that they believed in. Now, obviously, some people must have. But the idea that was what was actually believed by everybody, that was the superstitious stuff, by the intellectual side and all that, is nonsense. Because when we pierce that sometimes thick layer of symbolism, we always come to what I would call an aeon. We always come to the inspiring pattern in the whatchamacallit, why can't I think of it all of a sudden? The Mandelbrot set of reality, whatever, you know, the I can't think of the word. What am I thinking of? Oh my goodness.
Paradigm, perhaps.
No, it's a mathematical equation that produces a pattern that repeats over and over and over again. I can't think of the word for some reason.
So perhaps.
What, sweetie? No, not tessellation. No.
Fractal.
I'll think fractal. Thank you. Yes, the
Yes.
fractal of you know, what the ancients might have called the pleroma or chaos or Brahman. So all of these little waves in that field inspire the dreams, the delusions that we see, and that means that there's relationship there. This is why we have the same throughout every culture. You know, this is what Joseph Campbell was always working with, was noticing these same patterns in every culture, and you could trace them hierarchically to very fundamental archetypal ideas, aeons, if you will, that were the inspiration for these things. So, you know, the aeon of enlightenment would manifest in a dozen different ways in a dozen different cultures, you know, as different entities, caricatures, energies, whatever. And this kind of brings us to the runes, because my flimsy understanding would be that the runes represent aeonic ideas. In other words, aeonic essence that would have been relevant mostly to the people of that period and place. You know, you have certain things that they would have seen in their environment. And I said Esau on your last stream because it's like the easiest one for me to remember. It's just a line, everybody. And it looks like ice and it looks like a wall, but it's not just ice. Ice is what the physical manifestation of that aeonic concept would be. But the aeonic concept completely transcends just ice, right? And the same thing could be said of all runes. And that, I think, is what the mythology of Woden, which of course was a later, to my understanding, insert into Norse tradition. It wasn't originally, I don't think Odin was originally there. I think he was a later addition to the pantheon of Norse. But I think the mythology, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I've heard this from other people. So that mythology sort of illustrates where the realization came from, maybe. So any thoughts on that?
Well, originally, if you want to go back all the way to the Rig Veda, which is basically, I think, some of the earliest mythological parts that you'll find underpinning what happened in later changes in the northern European versions. Okay, the gods and the goddesses were originally what were shown forth in the Rig Veda. And they used to call themselves the children of the thunder god. And so Indra
I was going to say, you're talking about Indra there.
Yeah. And as time progressed, Indra morphed into Donar, Thunor, Thor. Okay, still the thunder god, still the great warrior. His weapon changed from an axe to a club to the hammer Mjolnir.
And we can actually trace it back to the Vajra, which is the original, which is that strange alien weapon with the multiple prongs that is held. Looks like a little bit of like a lightning bolt generator. And if we follow that back, we even see in the Proto-Indo-European cultures the same trend for it to be some sort of a spear or something like that projected lightning. And it wasn't just the lightning god that would have this, though it was known mostly with the sky, thunder, lightning god that would use this the most. So this object is a very interesting thing to people who study these things. This, whatever it is, well, I'll say it, the Vajra, because that's the one that's most notable, that's maintained its form the most, I would say, because something about Indian culture, okay, they're very good at maintaining their spiritual history, unlike the rest of the West, which is it's like people just repaving over the road over and over again. You lose everything. They're very good, especially, and they've influenced pretty much the entire, not the entire world, but most of the world as we understand it via the Silk Road. You go all the way to Asia, China, Japan, and even in Europe. It's obvious that ancient Vedic and Hindu philosophy at least inspired or was co-inspiring in Greece and everybody, quite literally, quite honestly. And
Now,
it probably comes from Proto-Indo-Europe. Go ahead.
Woden also is very ancient, and no less ancient than Indra. He was also called something different back in the days of the Vedas. Okay. Rudra Shiva was Woden. And if you take a look at what is modern day Iran, I believe that's what used to be called Persia. Back before the migration, the Great Migration, where a lot of the tribes moved into Europe and then made war there. I believe, just as a side note, one of the things that you read about in Voluspa, a very important writing in the northern mythologies, is the first great war between the Aesir gods and the Vanir gods, which I believe was a metaphor between the invading tribes and the original inhabitants of the land. And they fought, and neither side could win. So they decided to make a treaty and to merge. And so now, then, in the northern tradition, you have the Aesir gods, the gods of consciousness, and the Vanir gods, the gods and goddesses of the cycles. Okay, but when you go back into the Vedic period, before all of that happened, they also used to be harassing a lot of the nations around and about there, especially in Persia. And many of, Persia is the birthplace of Zoroastrianism. Okay, so if you've heard of Ahura Mazda or Ahriman or Angara-Mainyu, you're looking at the mythologies of Zoroastrianism. Well, in Zoroastrianism, many of the gods of those tribes became their demons. Okay?
Yes, correct.
It's such a,
it's a common tactic, especially, for some reason, I don't want to make it sound in any way ethnic oriented, but for whatever reason, a lot of Middle Eastern faiths like to demonize whatever they encounter that's not of them. So you have I don't necessarily mean Sumerians or Babylonians or whatever, because they're all kind of like the same seed. And the Egyptians, the same thing. They were quite willing to integrate each other's gods with each other and say, oh, that god is just like my god. Maybe they're the same guy and they just appeared to you this way. Or they found ways to just include them. If we look at, the Hellenistic period when you have Greece and Egypt, merging basically, they did that. A lot of the gods were syncretized. And that seems to be something that these monotheistic religions, either the only way that they will permit this is for those gods to be turned into angels or saints or demons. That's really the only ways they'll allow it. And a lot of the time they go with demon because they just do, for whatever reasons that they have.
Yes, just as a side note, if anybody's watching this and they're fascinated by the differences between the polytheistic pagan religions and the monotheistic religions and how they interacted, there was a book written, the name of the author escapes me, but you can search the title. It's called God Singular Against the Gods, plural. And it talks about how there was something called rigor or rigorism in the monotheistic faiths where they had to be right. And they were willing to lay down their lives for the sake of being right. And I'm not going to say here either that things were all sunshine and roses and wonderful with the human race before monotheism came along, because guess what? Human nature is what it is. People are on a learning path, and people did smart things and people did dumb things, no matter what epoch of history humanity has been involved in. So don't think, the glory of the old days. That's not necessarily the way it was in truth. What we need to remember is that much of what has gone on today, over the last 2,000 years, actually, since the great Christian conversion period, and now we have other monotheistic religions working in the same vein. I'm not going to get the YouTube channel in trouble by mentioning them. But these things exist, and there is more and more rigorism coming into effect even today, where it is more important to be right than it is to just be and to evolve.
That too. Yep.
And so if we can,
well, that's the demiurge, right? That would be, in the Gnostic sense, that would be the equivalent of the demiurge and its archons, which, don't take too literally, guys. Like, if you follow my channel long enough, you'll know that for me, all of these are symbolic of something unspeakable. So if I'm talking about the demiurge, I don't believe in a literal theistic demiurge that created the world. I think that's a metaphor for egoism in general, just the broad concept of egoism, which requires ignorance, which is the antithesis of wisdom, which would be Sophia. So wisdom gives birth to the demiurge via ignorance. So ignorance was what happened. And of course, part of that myth that people don't, I hate to go off on this tangent because I have to for a moment. Part of that myth is Sophia didn't use her mate to give the offspring, which meant there was no masculine influence. So there was a denial, and all forms of ignorance are a kind of denial. There's a lot of weird symbolism here mixed in the people. Anyway, the reason I'm bringing that up, though, is sort of a tangent. But what I really wanted to say was, if we look very, very carefully, and of course with a really generous definition of some of these terms, we see that most spiritual traditions, whatever religion it is, whether it be, indigenous style nature worship or whatever, or something more sophisticated. I shouldn't even say sophisticated, because honestly, some of those ancient indigenous beliefs are pretty sophisticated. But what we would think of as sophisticated, synthetic maybe would be a better word. They are almost all somewhere in there have a seed of either pantheism or monotheism to them. There is usually a supreme something, okay, whether it's a personified something or a primordial impersonal something, but that something isn't dead, right? This idea that reality is dead and then life emerges from it is a modern concept, which is actually quite irrational to me. It doesn't, this idea that life of course life is a I don't think people understand what that really is, myself included. It's sort of a mistake to think of life as something. But if we're going to pretend that life is something, this idea that life is an emergent property of dead stuff, that's as ignorant as when, I'm going to tell you guys a story and I'm going to tie it all together. Once upon a time, people truly believed that flies emerged from dead meat. They thought that dead meat caused flies. There was no process in their brain that included flies laying eggs and those eggs becoming maggots and the maggots becoming flies. They thought that life just came out of dead stuff. And our modern scientists mock this as ignorance on the part of our ancestors. And yet they still maintain the exact same thing. They just pushed the buck back to a dead earth, and then life just miraculously appears through abiogenesis. Now, my point isn't that abiogenesis isn't true, but my point is that this idea that life is an emergent quality of dead stuff is nonsense. And so too, tying it back to what I was saying, this idea that divinity could spring forth from nothing. In other words, there is no essence of conscious there. It's just dead stuff, and then God appears, or anything else. So there has to be something conscious. Consciousness is it. If you know my philosophy, everybody here should. I'm a non-dualist, which means consciousness to me is the fundamental thing that everything is. Everything is consciousness. Consciousness is an unspeakable quality. It looks like nothing. It looks like emptiness. It looks like no thingness, but it's everything at the same time. So this is actually echoed in most of the religions and spiritual paths that I look at. There's something there that reflects that. If you go back to, Hellenistic stuff, you have the primordial chaos, which was understood to not be literal empty nothingness. It was understood to be something paradoxically full. It was the word gap, but when they said, chaos meant gap, but what did gap mean? It didn't mean like literal emptiness, because all gaps have a bottom, right? There's a connection there. It meant a gap in what we would consider manifested reality. In other words, it's unmanifest reality. The darkness is unmanifest reality. The light is manifest reality. And this idea then indicates that if we look in all these other religions, we find it over and over and over again. There is a primordial something that then gives rise to personified deities that then somehow shape the world, okay? And the mistake, I think, that people make is that I guess the ancient people didn't have as strong a distinction between what was solid and what was ideal like we have today. Today, we divide things into the materialistic and the idealistic worlds, which are both reflections of something that's unspeakably true. The materialistic world is a projection of the unspeakable, and the ideal is just another kind of projection of that same unspeakable reality. So there's the base reality, which is consciousness, which is divinity, that projects into human experience anyway, in these kind of polarities of the ideal and the substantive, the material. But if you really look, they're both equally flawed. They're both equally illusory, because even that material idea is an idea, and even that idea requires materiality for the idea to stick. The best way I can illustrate this is that when you think of something as an imaginary idea, you think of, well, that's just an idea. That's idealism. However, that thing that you're ideating on requires some sort of material experience to have the qualia that creates the idea. Like, you can't have an imagination of a sunset unless you've seen a sunset. But then when you see a sunset, you can make the mistake of thinking that that's really out there. But in fact, that is a vibrating pattern of energy, consciousness, coming at us in a way that in our consciousness turns into this thing of light, sounds, and everything else. So my point is that all of this is Maya. It's all illusory. And then we overlay that with the mentalism of form and name, Namarupa. Okay. And that too, that brings us to the runes again, because the runes are almost like a consolidation of Namarupa into a very simple glyph, a very simple symbol, and that is like the condensation of that idea, because it's meant to, each rune is meant to be like a way to talk about the unspeakable.
Yes.
Okay.
Runes are most commonly known as having been carved into substances. Now, in later periods of time, they would draw them with, quill and parchment or what have you. But they used to take them and carve them on usually wood. There were some times that they carved runes on stone. Now, there are some stones that exist today that are still there that were filled with magical incantations, but many of the ones carved in stone were landmarkers. Okay, because as time progressed, they began to use runes more and more for writing. This was not originally what they were used for. They had an ideological meaning. They had a phonetic meaning, and they had a numerical meaning. So in other words, much like many other magical alphabets, they were both a letter and a number and a picture. And when you think about how these things were put forward, you would see them take the simplistic method of carving the runes, and they would carve them, stain them, usually with blood. It was blood magic, okay, using the runes. And later periods, they used what they call red ochre, which they called the blood of the earth. But still, they would often use blood even in those times, because there was a need for a sacrifice, not in the sense that you look at, modern movies and, the sacrifice. No. It was about what they called the gift for a gift principle to maintain the balance. So if you brought energy in to transform into something that was according to your will, you had to give something for it, because that's how it worked. Everything was in motion. Everything was being part of an expression that didn't stop just because you were doing something. Okay, and so that balance had to be maintained in order to keep things that were so chaotic that they would destroy all life on the outside of the enclosures. So there's three things I want to just quickly mention here. The tree, and trees play a very prominent role in Northern mythology and in many other mythologies around the world too. Okay, the first human beings were referred to as trees.
Yep, I was just going to get to that. Yep.
Ashk and Ambla, in other words, ash and elm. And there were gifts given to them by the three brothers, Othin, Vili, and Ve. Okay, one of the biggest gifts given by Othin was what they called Ond, and that was the breath of consciousness. And that's why the Aesir were called the gods of consciousness in many respects. And so that allowed them to have the same creative impulses as the gods, and the destructive ones too. And so all of this related to the tree, which they called Yggdrasil. And this tree is different than other trees in this sense. Say you're taking a look at Kabbalah or Qliphoth or what have you. What you're looking at there is a map of consciousness that could just as easily be, in fact, it was originally represented as a series of concentric circles. They were not places. They were modes of consciousness on the pathway of manifestation. Yggdrasil was created out of shamanic journeying. Those are the creation as it exists, not as modes of consciousness, although there are aspects of these 9 worlds, because there were 9 worlds in Yggdrasil's tree, that represented the tension of opposites. But it represents it in a much different way. If you're looking at Kabbalah, you're looking at a series of circles in 3 pillars. Okay. In Yggdrasil, you have that a 2-dimensional representation, but it was meant to be looked at as a 3-dimensional image. So in other words, there was a vertical plane and there was a horizontal plane. And they were in motion, all of them, always. And these motions are where the pathways of power existed. Now, the runes existed in all 9 worlds, but Odin did not create the runes. He found them in what many people believe was a symbolic of an initiatory rite, where he, according to Havamal, hung upside down on the world tree for 9 days and nights, pierced by his own spear, no drink, no food. And then finally, he gazed down into the underworld. And a lot of people with a Christian mindset think the underworld, oh my goodness. The underworld is actually where all of the worlds reside. It is part of the unmanifest, like you were saying. Okay? And it wasn't all a bad place. It was the realm of the dead. It was the realm of the discarnate. People.
And all of this is invisible.
And all this is invisible.
Right, which is ineffable, unspeakable, invisible. It's that same no-thingness, gap, abyss, chaos, primordial, all of that stuff.
And he found the runes, and he grasped the runes because he had paid the price for them, which was, of course, self-sacrifice. And that self-sacrifice doesn't mean you got to go poke a spear in yourself and hang upside down on a tree for a week and a half. What it does mean is that you're willing to take responsibility for your actions, for your thoughts, and for everything you decide to manifest. And this is where weird, that we talked about originally, WYRD, comes into play. It talks about the web of weird. It's like a spider's web, but intricate beyond all things, that's at the roots of the world tree. And every thought, every action, every potential drops down into what they called the well, in air quotes, of weird, and then would be spun out by the Nornir. And here's where it is a little different than, let's say, the Greek fates. Okay, many of you are familiar in Greek mythology with the fates and how, they would have a string and cut it when somebody was going to die and yada, yada, yada. That's all fine and good for Greek mythology. However, many people have imposed that on the Northern mythologies when that was not their focus or their mindset. They did not believe really in past, present, and future. Okay?
Which is a very mystical position to have, which is echoed in most of the most sophisticated, and by sophisticated I mean accurate, probably, mystical traditions. They all agree that time is illusory, and it's something that we manifest. It's not, it is not intrinsic to the nature of reality. Even physicists worth their salt will sort of admit this on some level. On some level, they'll admit it.
Oh, yes.
So,
but even the names of the Norns, okay, Urdr, okay, that is what has happened up until this moment. Okay, there was Verdandi. What is manifesting right now? And Skald, and it's interesting because skaldic poetry or skaldic prose kind of comes from that, and that was used very often in magical incantations with the runes and in other methods of magic too that they used. Skald meant what may become. So in other words, there were multiple threads of the web of weird where things could go.
So it sounds like we're talking about the multiverse that I'm constantly talking about, and that seems to be hitting the collective conscious hard the last few years. Almost like the hidden masters are trying to reveal to us that that is a very likely possibility, if not absolutely what is. And one of the things that's found again and again and again in mystical traditions again is that there is an infinity of possibility. It is only us that is limited to what we see. And that tells me that it is actually a rational idea. And maybe the way that the ancients realized it was that we don't see a border or an edge to reality. As far as we know, reality goes on forever. And if that's the case, then there's only so many ways things can happen. So they must happen again and again in similar ways. It could be cyclic as far as time goes. They all have different ways of explaining it, but there's either time is a cycle or reality is just so big that anything fits in it. So it's very likely that you'll run into yourself again and in a slightly different form. And so this idea that reality is multiversal or many worlds, as the modern science would put it, fits again quite neatly into most of the mystical traditions again. And I do consider at its core, the Norse tradition to be highly mystical. It is not just again, we see this through the lens of modern, materialistic scholars in academia who, have never really practiced a thing in their life. They've never, to them, it's all cerebral. And they look back and they see ignorant savages who tried to explain the world with gods when it really wasn't like that. My understanding is the ancients didn't try to explain the natural world with gods, okay? The natural world was already understood. The gods were just a way to communicate that which they understood. They were symbolic of something much deeper. So it wasn't that they didn't understand why we had seasons. I mean, they didn't know the technical scientific reason for it, but the idea that they believed that really the seasons were because Demeter was looking for Persephone is nonsensical, because that's not really what they probably believed. They just used that as mythology because the symbolism was important to them, that there was something else going on.
Yes, and also, when we take a look at things from the perspective of everything being consciousness, okay, how do you cause, let's say, certain elements of nature, or even certain of the elements, to be something you can work with? Not just in a magical sense, because there's an aspect of magic that is practiced by every person or we wouldn't exist. But how do you deal with that? Well, they would personify these things in not absolute perfection, but in a mirror of human consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And that would become a mask, a deific mask, if you want to call it that, for these powers.
Michael Ford has entered the chat.
You know?
Yeah.
And that's powerful. And the runes as well are far more than what many academia scholarly people would say they are. They were not just used for divination, if they were used much for divination at all.
Mm-hmm.
Save
when did that
magic.
start? When does that idea that the runes are a divinatory tool primarily?
Oh,
Because
yeah.
I've always seen them as not that. Same thing with tarot, by the way. If I
Yes.
before I let you answer, because tarot is like, oh, I use it for divination, but you want to know what I really like it for? The casting of spells, the sorcery, the act of sorcery, because they are like gateways for me to focus my attention energetically. So, yes, go ahead.
Oh no problem. The thing is with the runes, just like the tarot, they are more than just divination. Now there is a story where the Roman historian, I believe his name was pronounced Tacitus.
Mm-hmm.
It's a C. Some people call him Tacitus. I think that sounds kind of odd because it doesn't roll off the tongue as
The
well.
C,
but
the C, I
whatever.
believe, is actually supposed to be hard.
Yeah.
The way you're supposed to, the way the ancient Romans would have said Caesar would have, I can't say it. It would have been, it's not even Kaiser. That's actually wrong too, but it's closer to the actual, it's like, I think you're supposed to roll something in there. I have to look it up. I saw a really cool video.
Just like trill your R's when you're speaking.
Yeah, it's like Kaiser or so. It's something crazy. I have to look it up again, but it's not Caesar. Okay, that's the modern. It's not wrong, by the way. I watched a linguist explain why it's not wrong to say Caesar, and it's not more accurate to say Kaiser. But it's fascinating. But that's a.
But anyway, he saw some of the barbarian priests, the Northern European tribes, doing this grand divination for the entire tribe. And they carved some sort of thing on what they called blood twigs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, those could have been runes, but we're not told directly that they were. We don't know. Okay. However, we do know that there were people that practiced a type of magic that involved what we would call in modern day astral projection, where they would fare forth into the nine worlds and talk to the spirits about somebody's issue and then report back what they had heard. And that was the primary form of divination. However, when you read Havamal about the runes, after you read about the discovery of the runes, you start getting into the spell songs of Othin, okay, which were for magical purposes. Now, the runes, when they were used for magical purposes, were definitely gateways. They were not created by the gods. They were found. And this is just something that I throw out there for people to consider. When you read about, and again in Voluspa, this is where it's talking about before the fate of the world had been written out, and before the Norns came and so forth, the gods had this golden age, and they created temples. Well, who did they create temples to in the mythology? Okay, think about this as metaphorical, again, not as literal, but think about it for a moment. Would they have made temples to themselves? Okay, I don't think so.
Right.
I believe that the runes in the mythological context were the gods of the gods, because they were the gateways to the very powers of creation and destruction in the multiverse. And the runes were never meant to be looked upon as completely separate from one another. If you take a look at the mother rune concept, okay, and we find that in the restored ideological nature of the younger Futhark. All right. What they say is that all the runes were generated from the mother rune. And so if you take, say, examples from the Vedas, which again have a direct bearing on many of the mythologies that evolved in the North, there is this concept of all consciousness being like a diamond with many facets on it. Each facet is a window into a particular aspect of consciousness, but they are not separate. They are one diamond. Okay.
Yeah, it's similar to Indra's web. It's another metaphor that's like Indra's web, which is sort of the metaphor for the many ways that consciousness views itself from a multitude of perspectives, but each of them are still the same divine consciousness. It's one reflection eternally, and they're almost like facets of a jewel or reflections on different beads of dew on the web of Indra's, spider. Another thing I'd like to mention is, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the Turks had something that was eerily similar. And I've done research on this that says that they're probably not connected. But if you look up Old Turkish script, I'll be darned if that's not runes just a little different. It's the same. And people have said that, well, it looks the same because they used the same method of making them. They were carvings, so you don't use rounded shapes as much. You're going to use slashes and things like that. And that's why, but ironically, if you look it up, just Google it yourselves, guys, Old Turkish script, or Orkhon script is the other word for it. I wish I could put a screenshot of it up. I could probably do that. That's a pain in the butt. If I put a screenshot of it, you'll see. But it looks like a cross between Klingon and runes. Okay, like you quite literally, like, look up Klingonese and look up runes and put them side by side, and you're getting close to like the same thing. And there's older versions of it if you go back, and it's some of the characters are identical. Then I'm sure the meanings are different, but you have pretty much like so many symbols are the same. It's scary. So is this just a case of convergent evolution? Is it a case that maybe they had the same origins somewhere in the ancient histories? Or is it just that they, like I said, they converge because of the fact that they had to write them a certain way?
That's hard to say. Also realize that, these tribes that the Romans called the barbarians in the north traded with people all over the world. And so there's probably many things that influenced both sides of that trade equation that, ended up being incorporated as time went on, because you can see the rune staves take on different forms over the course of centuries. For instance, the younger Futhark is very different in many respects than the elder Futhark or the Anglo-Saxon Futhork. And yet it is probably understood by many that even those using with the younger Futhark were familiar with the elder. Okay.
And we also have to remember that we think of the Norse as just Vikings, which is absurd. Okay. That was a very small portion of their society. They were actually...
Vikings was a profession. It wasn't correct. A tribe.
So this is important because they actually had the equivalent of their own Silk Road going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, the Norse people, such that they traded, and there are finds that show there was, art, crafts, and things from places that were not anywhere near where they lived. Things coming from, if I remember correctly, even as far as India and Asia were found, and vice. So there was trade going on, both of ideas and stuff and goods and clothing and weapons. And, there's even a link, I believe, someone may have to do the research for me. I heard this, but I could be wrong, between the Wootz steel of India and the Nordic, twisted steel that they did. There was some cultural reference that's why they have similar stuff. Like they were emulating something. Okay, so I don't know about that one. I have to look that up again. But it's really fascinating stuff to realize. We, again, looking back, as modern people, think of the ancient world as a bunch of dummies. But they were absolutely not stupid. In fact, the biggest difference wasn't in what they knew, but how quickly the information traveled. That's the biggest difference. So when we look at the ancient world, we think of all these isolated tribes of humans that never interacted. You know, the Italians never interacted with the Norwegians, and the Norwegians never interacted with the people in the Mediterranean, Middle East, and the people from Ireland never interacted with the people from India. And some of that's true because there's just too much in between that wouldn't have been a direct interaction. But a lot of this idea that there was no interaction or influence is absolute garbage. You go back to, even in Jesus's time, there would have been Buddhist monks in the region, almost certainly. If you go back to the Library of Alexandria and all of this, there would have been, everybody in the world would have been there. They would have sent their wisest people there to study. The idea that there was no interaction is still, again, this modern superiority complex that we have, that, oh, they were just ignorant savages just beating drums. They had no idea what they were doing. But we see, again, the same patterns over and over and over again, not just because humans notice the same things and it's convergent evolution, but I think because of some cultural diffusion as well, that there was definitely some interaction. And again, we look, all of these traditions, all of these religions, we have almost always a similar myth that pops up of death and rebirth that causes enlightenment. This idea that you have to go into the underworld. Every single one has an underworld myth that, if we look at their mystery cults, their mystery schools, there was almost always a little bit of a psychedelic or ecstatic ritual going on, where you would go, there'd be drumming, maybe there's some drugs, maybe there's some alcohol, whatever it is, and your ego death happens. You meet God, essentially, and realize it's yourself, most likely in most cases, and come out of it. And a lot of times this was done in a cave in the underworld, either symbolically or literally. If you go, people look at these cave paintings in France and all of this from the Neolithic period, and what they don't realize, a lot of people, is that this wasn't just some people going there to draw on the walls. Okay, these were ritual centers. These were where people would go, trip balls, meet God, come out, and know what they were. This wasn't just like, Picasso's and whatnot. This wasn't, again, we see these things through the idiotic lenses of modern world. And what we don't realize is that tradition never stopped. It carried on from every culture, pretty much, in the world throughout history, to the Greeks with their mystery schools, to the Norse probably with their, their mushroom taking and their little drum circles and whatever. I'm sure they did a lot of cave work too. Everybody had this. Everybody did. And it's found in every myth, from, Horus, Osiris, Jesus, Mithra, Odin on the tree, having to go to the underworld, over and over and over and over and over and over. And people say, oh, it's just a myth about the sun going under. That's what it is. It's so they can explain the day and the night cycle. Fuck you, idiots. Like, you can't see this obvious thing that really is obvious. So why did they all have this same myth? Why did Jesus die and in 3 days resurrected and blah, 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 blah? This is a metaphor for someone who's going through the ego death experience, either through psychedelics or whatever method, okay, induced or otherwise, and they go into
through physical deprivation.
Yes, precisely, because there's actually a lot of ways. I prefer the meditative way because to me it's really simple. I've been doing it since I was a kid. I just, thought processes stop. I put myself in a situation where I am just alone with consciousness itself until that's all I'm seated with. And then I go, okay, that makes sense. I don't need to necessarily, I still might, but I don't need to do all those things to reach that state. But other people do. And that's fine, but that's a common thread. Again, people would use psychedelics. They'd starve themselves. They would drum and they would dance and they would work themselves up. They would get drunk. There's almost, they would hold their breath for long periods over and over and over and get themselves into these states of altered states of conscious in which they would check out. Their ego would check out. Their ego identity would switch off, and they're just, ayahuasca. I mean, come on, there's no end to this. It's everywhere. Oh, yeah. It's everywhere. And this idea that this is just silly little let's explain the sun story. It's just, I'm so tired of it. I really, it's really frustrating.
One of the ways that they used to do this in rune magic was through chanting. And chanting actually has three purposes, okay? It's not just for magical things. But chanting is not about you focusing on what you're chanting. All right. That's like reciting the telephone book and trying to remember every phone number as you say it over and over again. That sounds a little bit more like cramming for an examination or something. That's not what it's about. Yes, you are going to eventually be doing more internal reverberation than external. But what you really want to do is eventually not know what the heck you're even saying, because it's just a vibration that is opening a door. And this is what Rune Galder was. Now, this is different than faring forth, like in many, what it's pronounced seidh, Seidhr. In the Old Norse, that was faring forth more often than not. And of course, it was kind of an umbrella term for all of magic in that sense, but it came to be more focused on the divinatory aspects, and also shape-shifting and bringing about death curses and so on and so forth. It was used in war at times. But rune magic was a little different when you're dealing with rune magic proper, because what they would do, and it says this in the Havamal too, do you know how to carve? There was a certain procedure. Do you know how to stain? Do you know how to call forth? Do you know how to put to sleep? And these were all part of creating a vibratory change, because everything is an energetic structure, whether you're dealing with what we call the physical world or the ethereal. It is an energetic structure that's in motion. And when you're doing magic, you're creating a vibratory change that you, as the person working the magic, needs to be able to vibrate at in order to see successful manifestation. Okay? You can't be thinking about who's winning the stock car race while you're doing magic of any kind. It's just not going to be fruitful for you. Okay? And so this is one of the reasons why they carved runes, because you get so involved in the process when you're carving it. Now, it's effective if you draw it too, but there's a few extra hoops you jump through to get your consciousness in the same state. But you can lose yourself in actually carving the rune. And you just carry that on with the staining of the rune. Because what you've done when you carve the rune is you've created a physical body for that energy. Okay, when you sacrifice by inlaying that with your blood or with red ochre, if you've consecrated it, is you are giving it its life force. Then when you begin to seriously, you've been sort of muttering the name of the rune all through this process, but now you start to, bring that vibration to the name of the rune. You're calling it, and you're doing it interactively. This is something that I haven't really found in other magical systems. Because you see, the runes in some strange way that I have never been able to explain, and other people who have experienced this too have no way of explaining it. The runes in some strange way, when you are calling them, they are self-aware. And they know. And it's like as you begin to touch on them, they begin to vibrate back to you.
This resonates with the idea that I said that they're the Norse version of what other people would understand as an aeon. In Gnosticism, or even Crowley talked about aeons, and the aeons are technically impersonal things. They are conscious, but they are impersonal because they're patterns. They're fundamental patterns, which then can be manifested by human awareness as personified or physical or whatever phenomena. And so this resonates with that idea. I might have to look into that more and see maybe the runes represent or could be represented by divinities, as we know that there are, if we separate them by et, right? You have the 3 ets and each one is by a different, well, that's neither here nor there. But you also brought up a couple of really important things that are deep stuff that hopefully the audience will enjoy hearing about. We're talking about mantras and what would be transcendental meditation in India. Or Buddhism, or Japan, or Asia. And I saw Atropa bring this up a little bit after the fact. there's some interesting things here, okay, to my understanding, as someone who practices those things a lot. And I don't necessarily use the seed mantras that are formal or traditional other than Om. I think Om's really the only one you absolutely should use if you're going to be using transcendentals. I don't like this idea that some guru is supposed to give you a special magic word. That's a psychological trick more than it is something, I refuse. In other words, what I'm trying to say is I refuse to think that there's an abracadabra that opens a door. Okay. I think that these are symbols, and the symbols, yes, there's cultural symbols that work for a lot of people, especially if you belong to that culture. But the idea that the word is magical is kind of, I don't buy that at all. I think it requires a certain cultural reference point. Like when I see the runes, I lack whatever cultural anchor that makes them specifically mean something to me, right? As strongly. That doesn't mean that they will never work. It just means I don't have the lexicon. I don't have I haven't been educated to the world that they exist in. If I was, like, if I read the Havamal, if I had all this orientation, they probably would. Just like someone who looks at Greek culture and looks at the gods and goes, these are kind of goofy, that they don't work for me. Or India, same thing. But if you get immersed in the culture, now they make sense and they're powerful. So anyway, that's neither here nor there. My point, though, is that when working with, we would say mantras, okay? A lot of times this is mantras, or you use a single word. Mantra can be a string of words, a string of ideas, sounds, or just one. And there's different philosophies and different ways to use them. I forget the words for it, but there's different ways to understand them. One way is that, take Om, for example. Well, Om isn't just Om. It's also the silence between. It's actually 4 characters, not just 2 or 3. It actually is meant to be the opening, the resonance, and the closing, and then the silence. So there's 4 parts to Om, not just the sound. There's the silence between. That silence between is the key, because that silence is where you're supposed to encounter consciousness by itself, because it's meant to be symbolically representing the opening and closing of not consciousness, but the mind, which when open actually is the silence. That's the most open state the mind can be in, because it's not focused on anything. It is literally everything. Okay, so it's silent. It seems like silence. Then as it shrinks down and right, it's actually a focusing of awareness into the here and now, the ignorance of here and now. Actually, we think of this as some highly knowledgeable state that we're in. No, this is the most ignorant state you can be in, because you're ignoring the past and the future. You're ignoring the known and the unknown. You're just focusing on what you can experience. That's like dead center of that Aum thing. Then that silence is when she pointed out, Atropa pointed out, it makes the infinity symbol, because there's Aum, 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 and there's that emptiness in the middle where all things are one. Okay, now, so that transcendental meditation, the important part is in the silence to find the conscious divine. And the sound, whether you're using Lam or Om or whichever one you're using as your seed mantra, is meant to bring your conscious awareness to whatever that symbolizes, okay? And it eventually you get longer and longer between the recitations and more silence, and eventually you don't even speak, because you can't say for like 10 minutes, okay? You get to a point where that can be stretched out internally. You don't have to, but you can stretch that out for a long time, including the silence. A lot longer than your breath can hold it. Mm-hmm. I don't need that, but some people really get off on that, and it's a really good practice and good for them. Now, that's one version that's the transcendental method. Then there's a method where you are, I did it for the Lucifer chant that I have. And the Lucifer mantra, most powerful. If you guys look it up on my channel, it's very popular. It's like 32,000 views, 31,000 views. And I did it in the style of someone reading the Heart Sutra, which is, you can either go by the heartbeat or by the beating of a drum or both. And I did it at a pretty reasonable pace, bum, 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 Lucifer, oh, Lucifer. Now, what's meant to happen is you are reciting something that what you're doing is you're giving your egoistic mind something to fixate on, which is the same thing that the Om is doing when you're doing the regular transcendental method. You're giving the egoistic mind something to fixate on. that it doesn't have to think about. So your conscious attention doesn't have to guide it in the direction of the mantra. It will be a reflex of the mind to do. So like if you're doing the Heart Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, whatever, you're literally just reciting this thing that you've learned to recite, giving your mental mind something to do. This way, the left brain will be so focused on that, consciousness can decouple from that process a little bit and observe it externally rather than from the middle of it. So it becomes, you go from you're saying the mantra, whatever it'll be, Lucifer, 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 you go from you're the one saying it to it's no longer you that's saying it. It's something your body's doing without you. It's just happening and you're just there watching it. And as this detachment happens, you hit that transcendental state again, because now you've detached. Your consciousness has sort of unplugged from its avatar a little bit, and now it's watching the avatar from like a third person, if you will, symbolically speaking. Okay, and then as this disconnection happens, you become aware of just awareness itself. So again, you hit this transcendental state. Now, what's the point of all of this besides just enlightenment? That's really
it's got a lot to do with magic.
Correct. So what ends up happening is, as you lose, when I say lose, it's not a loss like you're losing something, I need to get it back. You're really cleansing. You're really clearing away the clouds, if you will, such that divinity shines through directly. I call this the hand of God. Okay, you're becoming the ascended master, even if only for a moment. You are fully submitting to the Tao, which is what you are. It's not an external submission. You're not submitting to a God external to yourself. The ego is going, okay, I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do now. You set aside the egoistic idea that you desire and thus act based on desire, like you have any control. Instead, you become the hand of God, which is another way of saying fully in the Wu Wei mindset, which is literally becoming the Tao, letting go of egoistic attachment that guides you, which is really just an echo. Okay, ego is just an echo saying I did that. The Tao manifests directly without that thing in the way. You literally become fully engaged with Wu Wei. That's actually the most magical state you can possibly be in, because you are literally in full resonance with the divine, acting in this moment. The whole idea that you cause anything, remember what he said in the beginning about Tao being purposeless. The whole idea that the ego, like, oh, I'm going to do magic and make something happen. That is an ego statement. It's fine. You can do it. It's fun. But until you transcend that in ritual, doing whatever it is that gets you there, and get to this no-minded hand of God, transcendental state of just being Wu Wei, letting go, being ascended master in the moment, literally acting completely spontaneously and intuitively. Your ritual could just look like you going like this and wiping it on a wall. It doesn't matter. You have let go completely of all egoistic ideation and letting the flow of the Tao just happen. That is the most powerful state you can, and because power loses all meaning when the divine is in motion, because the divine, you can't be powerful without something resisting you, and nothing resists the divine. It simply does. So,
and
yes.
If I can just interject here, this is something that when you're Galdering runes, what you're describing here from the Taoist perspective is actually what you're trying to do in rune magic when you're doing this, okay? Because
again, it's so all connected, isn't it?
This is why I say you need to memorize your incantation, because your incantation, which you don't use until the end, is your actual intent. But if you have to sit there and think about what I'm going to say when that happens, you've just broken that whole purpose for doing the Galdering in the first place. When you're Galdering the runes, okay, whether you're doing one rune, a series of runes, or what they call a bind rune, which is where you combine several into a single glyph.
Which is basically where the idea of sigils come from.
Exactly. And you're calling out the rune. You're doing that vibrational call. What you're seeking to do is eventually, as you are doing this, And I always tell people in our Patreon group, you know, you intuitively know when this has occurred. Okay. You begin to be doing this whole galdering like you're watching somebody else do it. And it's just an automatic thing.
It's just a happening.
When you get to that state, and you know that state because it's different, it has a different feel to it than anything else that you are ever in your day-to-day life. That's when you speak forth your incantation, and you speak it forth in the past tense. Because tomorrow never comes. You know, we've just talked earlier about how time is a construct even. Mm-hmm. All right. You're not thinking about what's manifesting right now because that's changeable. That's changeable and beyond your conscious volition. Okay. You put it in the past tense because that is the language of consciousness stating that this is actually what you want. All right. And it may not make sense, you know, when I say it in the past tense, but it works. I don't know why it works exactly, but it does. Okay. You put it in the past tense and it is looked upon as though it had already been done. And that's basically, I believe, the way consciousness actually works. It's not sitting there saying, you know, on the grandest scale of things, gee, I wonder what I'm going to create next. It all happens as though it had already been done. So you're just going into the same language, so to speak, as consciousness, because you realize that in order to touch that language, and language isn't even the right word, but it's the only way I can really express this. Okay, that language is not like human speech, where, you know, we talk about who's going to play soccer tomorrow. It is a language of feeling, knowing, and experiencing. That's all it is. And so, you know, when this is a side note too, in meditation or anything else you're doing too, when they talk about going into non-thought, they're not talking about that you don't have a thought in your head. Well, if that were the case, what would you ever be able to learn from it? What it is you are no longer thinking in the ego mind's language. In fact, it may be absolutely silent without being silent, if that makes sense. You're not verbalizing, you're not narrating, but you are feeling, knowing, and experiencing.
I like the way you put that, because at first I was going to say, well, now hold on a minute, but then when you clarified it, it really is actually correct. Because as I've said to people who have questioned me about this no mind thing that I talk about, one of the things that you have to understand is, number one, you can't stop your subvocalization. You can't stop the visualization. What you're really doing is you're not looking at it. Mm-hmm. You're shifting your conscious away from ideating on it. In other words, it'll begin when you first let go. This is why that Om mantra is so useful. You're giving your mind something to do, and then there's silence, and then that silence is something that you're training your consciousness to look at rather than the blah blah blahs in your mind. Mm-hmm. Once you start doing that, then the brain reciprocates and says, okay, we're not being paid attention to. I'm going to shut up a little bit. I'm not going to do all this other crap. I'm going to let this non-verbal and non-visual, in other words, the right side of your brain, which is more directly connected through consciousness than the left. The left is an echo. The right is what is. Okay, that's one way to think of it. The left is the left brain is sort of like how we talk about what is, and the right brain is what is. So once we get the left brain to not stop, it's just not being a blabbermouth all the time, like I usually do when I start talking. It becomes as if it is silent. But then, like you said, it is not that you stop thinking. If we describe thinking as knowing, experiencing, being able to act, that doesn't stop. What stops is the egoistic attachment to those things. They simply become a thing that happens, not a thing that you plan. And some of my deepest realizations happen in that state, because I actually, it depends on the day, but I spend 2/3, 3/4 of the day in a state like that. I don't like to have my brain blabbing. I can't stand it. I try to get to and just be there. And people say, well, how do you function? Well, simple. I try not to do math, because math is hard to do, because it's a language, it's a notation. But logic is easy. The logic of math is easy in that state. Having philosophical ideas and all of these things are easy. Like I often tell people, do you have to think about making your legs walk over to the refrigerator and get a soda out? Do you have to think through everything? No, the thoughts are something that happen afterwards as a commentary over it, that gives you, even the decision to go get it is not the thoughts that you had. It's not the words in your mind said, I want a soda. Those words are an echo, like a little child repeating after mommy and daddy, echoing what they say, and then taking credit for it like they did it. The reality is the unspoken, unthought intention of having that drink happened way before the thought ever occurred to you to do it. So that is what you're trying to get in tune with when you learn to silence, being again a metaphor, silence the thinking mind. You're learning to just be in that state where you don't have this middleman getting in the way. If you've ever practiced martial arts, this is a very important state to be in, to practice, to fight. Okay, because if you're sitting there thinking everything through, look, it's one thing to think ahead of time and have a little strategy. But once you're throwing hands and swords and guns and stuff are flying around, the more you mentalize, as in, I should walk over there, I should shoot this guy, I should block this punch, the easier you are to defeat. You have to be not reactionary, but you have to respond, you have to act, not in a reactionary way. And you can only do that if you're not clouded, if your brain is not clouded, if you're literally just in the moment and acting. You can fight better than someone who is. The reason I know this is there's actually a trick called breaking someone's OODA loop. You actually interrupt their thought process with a stupid question. I've seen it happen. You could be in the middle of a literal fight and be like, where does the white go when the snow melts? And while their brain is trying to go like, what does that even mean? That's when you can clobber them, because you've interrupted their flow. And if you're not doing that, if your brain isn't you don't have a flow to interrupt as easily. You're just acting. So you're doing a better job, right? So ultimately, I think that was a really good point. I think it was a really good way of putting it, because it is a little bit incorrect. In fact, the Zen masters would say this idea that you can go around having the goal is not to become a piece of wood. Okay, that's not the goal here. The goal is to right. You're not supposed, because you can still be alive, but a piece of wood has no soul, has no, it does, but it doesn't have the same essence. So your goal isn't to become a vegetable. Your goal is to let go of the distracting, because those distractions, those are the clouds that block consciousness from knowing itself. So that's really, really big, really, really big. So I think what we should do in a few minutes is we should start taking questions and comments, super chats, whatever from the audience, especially if you want to ask Dan a question. But Dan, where can everybody find you if they want to? I hear a lot of people saying, wow, these guys are awesome. Dan's awesome. He's really got good stuff. So where can they find Dan in the future?
Well, there's a couple of places, two in particular. One on YouTube. You can find us very simply by either typing TDP Video Cast in the search feature in YouTube, or you can go to our website, which is tdpvideocast.ca. And remember the CA rather than the .com. Okay. If you hit .com, you're going to find the old website, which hasn't been looked upon in many, many years. .ca, tdpvideocast.ca. And there you will find access to the YouTube channel on the streaming page. You'll find access to where our Facebook page is, and Twitter, and so on and so forth. And you can get a hold of me as well through the contact form there, or just emailing me at the email address host, which is obviously HOST, at tdpvideocast.ca. Those are the best ways to get in touch with me, because if you try to use Messenger or some of these other things, I get so many messages that it might disappear in the sea and I might accidentally miss you. But
or let's be honest, I have to be sincere. I have gotten to the point where it's like, I don't feel like reading this or respond. It just gets draining. I realize that people are inadvertently sometimes acting like vampires. They don't know it. They don't mean to do it. I'm not mad at you guys, but it is like everybody wants to show me their book or their dream or their this or their that. And I just don't have it in me to read everybody all the time, guys. No offense. By the way, there is somebody here. I don't know, somebody named EA Queeting. Apparently they are watching. I don't know if they're any relation to my friend. They sound like it. I don't know if they are my friend. I welcome them. I'm glad you're here. But yeah, we'll take questions in a minute. So I want you guys to get your questions ready and your comments ready that you want Dan especially respond to, because I don't think he's reading the chat like I am. But I would like you guys, if you have anything that you want him to talk about, or you want us to talk about, or you want me to talk about, now would be the time to get it prepared. Please put it in all caps or super chat, especially if you want to go to the front of the line. But all caps makes it easier for me to see across the situation here like that. And if you want to find Dan's channel, you can also go to the pinned chat comment. It should be the pinned comment in the chat, and it's also in the description of this video. So that's the link to his YouTube is in the pinned blue thing at the top of the chat box. And it probably won't be a comment. It's in the description of the video if that's where you want to find it. Okay. So one thing I'd like to bring up, and this has a little bit more to do with current events and the world at large and everything going on. One of the things that we'll say, the cabal, the globalists, the whatever word you want to use for them, the subversives of modern society have done is they've absolutely stripped us. And I don't just mean us, although I do specifically mean, people of European, Caucasian, whatever. I'm not into the race game, guys. But people of this heritage, we have been stripped. Originally by Christianity, but then now in the modern world, we're not even allowed to have that. We have been stripped of much of our spiritual heritage, whether you're, someone from Ireland, England, and Celtic myth and lore, or the Germanic or Norse, or even Mediterranean. You have probably, with the exception of Mediterranean stuff, especially Roman and Greek, you've pretty much lost all of that. And that's all been taken from you, and it's been discouraged. And some of the things that are most strongly discouraged, especially now, is this idea of, the divine masculine in people has been gradually getting stripped away from our culture. And it doesn't necessarily mean to be manly, okay? But the divine masculine is more than just being manly. Manliness is just a very base manifestation of the divine masculine. This is an important conversation that I think the Norse and European primal, essence would understand. And to break this down, I want to start by saying the difference between the divine masculine and feminine is one is receptive and one is assertive. And the interesting thing is that they have to go hand in hand. You cannot be assertive without receptiveness. The receptiveness inspires the inspiration to happen. Like I was saying before about the Tao, right? The Tao is purposeless, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't manifest in a way that has cause and effect or purpose and outcome. The purpose of this lighter, right? So we'll say the masculine of this lighter is to cause fire. Well, the feminine of this lighter is I need things to burn. So the I need things to burn causes the lighter to exist, and the lighter exists to burn things, right? So this is that yin yang in motion. Now, our modern civilization has been shifting us more towards the divine feminine, in that we're not, and I'm not just talking about boys and girls. Get this nonsense out of your head that it has anything to do with what's between your legs, although that is a manifestation in its own way of those things. People get like sex gender confused. We're not talking about that. It plays a role, but let me finish this thought. Maybe we'll see if I can get it there. The modern world is imposing more and more on us as a species, the divine feminine out of balance, becoming the main thing. And again, I'm not just talking about feminism, okay? I'm talking about the divine. So what is the divine? So we have a lot of people who are being programmed to be receptive and never assertive, to be entitled and demanding and requiring and inspiring others to give them and fulfill them, and never fulfilling, never doing, never achieving, never trying, never striving, never asserting anything. And that is something that's being lost. How many of you guys are risk takers in any way, shape, or form? I bet you a lot of you are not. No offense. I'm sure a lot of you guys are very good people. There's nothing wrong with being a little passive and being bending and yielding. You must be both. But how many of you have lost the ability to take risk or assert or to push or to not just like inspire change, but to be the vehicle for change, to assert change, to do what needs to be done? How many of you guys look up at the world right now and go, wow, this really sucks. I wish there was something I can do. That's because you're out of balance. Your divine masculine's been taken from you. Again, you could be a girl. Like, I'm not talking about this like just guys here, although more guys will probably
polarity, I think, right. What you're trying to say. Yeah.
Yes. And I think a lot of guys in particular will feel this though, because one of the things about being of maleness is to be able to assert when necessary. And it's there for women too. Again, I don't mean that it's not, but we do notice that the females in our society are encouraged to be assertive now, while the males are not. So it's certainly playing a role in that. But overall, our society is being pushed more and more towards the divine feminine, and it's really out of balance. And how do we fix that? Well, you've got to recognize that that is an inspiration. That's a divine feminine at work. The divine feminine will balance itself because it will create the need for the masculine. And it's doing so now. The masculine will have to step in. The problem is the powers that be, they want to be the masculine energy. This is why they're always so, patriarchal, if you will. They want to be the divine masculine that puts its finger down, puts its phallus into your womb and causes you to give birth to what they want. Okay?
What an image, man.
But that's literally it, though. I mean, look, you can break everything down like, in a hermetic way between this male and female thing. That's literally the phallus, bang, the wand. They're trying to be the wand to the womb of humanity. And they have done this by telling us we can't be the womb. How many of you guys feel like you can't do anything on your own? How many of you guys are self-made? How many of you guys feel like you can be an expert at something without a degree? Why do you have to have permission to be good at something? Why do you have to have permission to take initiative? Do you not see this subtle twisting of a screw that's tightening you into your cave, into your cage, into your shackles even now? It's really obvious to me. I see it everywhere I go. It started with me because I noticed a trend many years ago where people would say, well, you shouldn't really talk about these things because you don't have a degree. Beyond that just being an appeal to authority, that is an attempt to strip me of my ability to just assert and act. I don't need a piece of paper. Who gave the first guy that piece of paper so that he could give the piece of paper to the next guy? This is the world we're weaseling our way into, and it's by design. So we have to begin to assert a little bit more. We have to take more and more, and when I say assert, I don't mean be a dick. Obviously, I don't mean be a dick. I mean you have to have boundaries. You have to, when you recognize a need, you have to act and take care of it. This is that responsibility thing. The divine masculine is the responsible side of the equation. It says, well, I have to do this or else we're not going to eat. I have to do this or else I'm not going to succeed. That's being stripped of us. Look around you at all the people, especially under a certain age. It's all more and more an attitude of the world owes me. I don't want to work for it, or I already worked for it. It now owes me. It's not this homesteading mentality. This creative mentality has been completely stripped of a lot of people. And when you have somebody who steps up and starts to be creative and try to cause and try to inspire and try to do that work, what happens? A lot of the time they get steamrolled, especially if their idea of what should be doesn't match with the hidden master's idea of what should be. because they want to be the phallus. They don't want you to be that, unless you're trying to achieve the same thing that they are. It's sort of like that, what is that thing? The basilisk, what's his name? Something's basilisk, that if you don't help make it, it'll destroy you when it resurrects you. It's a little bit like that, in that if you're not working towards their goals, they're going to destroy you. And unfortunately, guys, the longer we don't face that, the worse it's going to get.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that everywhere. We see, you know, every time that we try to stand up, we get called names, racist, bigots, or on the other side, you know, let's be fair. You know, I don't want to be completely one-sided here. They'll get called names too. So what do we do about it? You know, we have to get our balls back, would be one way of putting it, in a more, you know, gruff way. We have to get our balls back. And for you women, that means gets your oves back too. We have to get it back and act on these things. And we have to be outspoken, and we have to stop worrying about what people think of us.
And that is a key right there. Because, you know, if you really want to be free, stop caring about what other people think of your essence. I'll say that again. If you really want to be free, stop caring about what other people think of your essence. Because when you do that, you're giving all of the power that resides in you. If you want to call it the divine, if you want to call it something else, doesn't matter. You are taking that out of yourself, figuratively speaking, and putting it outside of yourself in the opinions of other people. And that makes you a slave. And how is that different than the slave philosophies religiously that have plagued the human race for the last couple thousand years? It's the same shit, different pile. Mm-hmm. That's, you know, just what I wanted to interject here, because freedom is so important.
That's that Luciferian energy that, you know, why I call myself a chosen of Lucifer, because the Luciferian energy is to recognize that and then to adapt and overcome it, you know, and to be, it doesn't mean that I mean, of course, the higher wisdom is none of this is wrong. It's all the Tao. Right? All of this is divine. If all is divine, nothing is forbidden. So you have to have a level of detachment. You have to have a level of stoic acceptance. But that doesn't mean that you stop your own nature. Like, your own nature is part of the Tao. That nature is probably not to be a pushover that the elites can push around. And they're not really elites. They like that word. And someone gave me a good reason for it, because it's got the word L in it. And they are, you know, they see themselves as divine beings. But we won't go into that. That's some conspiracy shit. But the point is that, you know, like you said, you can't let other people's opinions of you necessarily shape you. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have any feedback going on. It just means that don't highlight to the point where you are a puppet to their ideals. This is why I have a saying that I make every now and then: do not put me on a pedestal. People think of, like, don't you want to be on a pedestal? Wouldn't it be awesome to be on a pedestal? Everyone to love you? No. And I go, no, that means you own me. That means that I have to fit in your little box. Otherwise, you're not going to like me. So I don't give a fuck. Don't put me on a pedestal. If you put me on a pedestal, I will find a way, either intentionally or subconsciously, to piss you off, because I do not like when people kiss my ass over my... It doesn't mean be a dick to me either, but I can tell when you just treat me as another person versus when you look up to me and exalt me, or when you don't like me. Either one kind of grates on me. I just want you to treat me like another person like you. And ultimately, when someone puts me on a pedestal, that means that I have to conform to their ideal of goodness. Otherwise, I could lose their favor. That to me is not a world I want to live in on any level. So I don't like that. So I'm saying apply that to the rest of the world. Apply a similar principle. It doesn't mean you're a dick. You know, you're not trying to hurt people. It just means don't let other people decide who you are. And you're going to have a much more fulfilling life. I would rather be a homeless guy in a box and happy with who I am than conform to whatever somebody's standard of happiness is and not be happy. So, all right. I think it's time for these questions, guys. So hopefully you guys have some questions or comments. Please put them in all caps starting now. Give me your questions or comments, especially for Dan. And while you're typing those up, I'll ask Dan for his input. What would the Norse, the Old Norse and you know, ancient European people have to say about what I just said about being more masculine, and I don't mean guy with a beard. I'm talking about the divine
Oh,
masculine.
yes. Yeah. You're talking more about a polarity and an exchange between the creative and receptive aspects of power. Well, there was a lot more of a symbiosis between the positive and negative, or the masculine and feminine polarity, than a lot of historians give credit for. To give an example, the wife had the keys to every aspect of the entire estate. In fact, it was ritually given to her when she got married, which means the husband didn't have those keys. His wife did. And there was a joke meme that I saw that actually kind of put it in perspective. It showed this lady, doing the lopping off of the head of the chicken for supper. And it showed the warrior coming in with his bearded axe. And then it said, "Don't tick off someone who has a bigger axe than you do." And it showed the wife's axe was like this giant battle axe that she was chopping the head of the chicken off, and he was looking at his little axe. No, in all seriousness, though, there was a lot more of a symbiosis there. There wasn't so much of a strong regulations of morality such as what they have in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and so forth. It was a lot more free-flowing. It was a lot more fluid. But one of the big things, regardless, was that the preservation of the family and the community and the tribe through whatever threats might be out there was a paramount concern. And along with that, the desire to be remembered by future generations. In fact, that was tied up with their entire concept of immortality. The biggest thing that you could do to harm another person was to erase them from history, to make it so that nobody remembered their name.
Mm-hmm. And that is found in every culture again.
Well,
you
yes,
see
even
that in
in ancient
Sumeria,
Egypt, when they
Egypt.
would strike the name of someone they didn't like off of every statue and obelisk, and similar
this
type
tells
of
me
thing.
that these people understood that this self is a mirage, it's a myth. You don't actually exist as this thing. This is a story that you tell about yourself. Mm-hmm. And if consciousness wants to experience this again in the future tense of this reality, yes, it can go back and experience this life as many times as it wants. But to have a continuation of this character, shall we say, that character has to live on somehow, and what better way than in the consciousness of the collective of humanity, becoming a superhero, becoming a god, a myth, a legend. In so doing, that can influence the world, or at least play a role in the world forever. This is how one becomes a god, is they literally become remembered. If someone's an author and you've written a book, successful or not, there's a good chance someone will read it again someday, if not now. I've written 3 books. They've been very successful. There's thousands of copies, I guess, out there altogether when you combine all 3 books. Lots of people have read it. Thousands of people have read it. And they're in digital. They're in hardcover, well, not hardcover, but digital and paperback. Somebody somewhere, so long as there isn't some kind of super disaster, will stumble upon my work again, almost certainly. Might be 100 years from now, might be 1,000 years from now, but it will be out there to exist, and my influence will be there. Now, when talking about this, we're actually invoking the Greek idea of how gods die and are born and so on. Mm-hmm. How do you kill a god in Greek mythology? Probably not that different from many others. Because you can't kill them in a way that a mortal dies. You can't just chop their head off and they're dead. To kill a god, they have to be forgotten or broken into a million billion little pieces. So what's that the symbol of? Well, they're forgotten. Obviously, that's the easy one. We know that you strike them from the record, they're forgotten. There's no god there anymore because they fade away. Okay? But when they're chopped apart, that's like taking somebody's legacy and letting a lot of people retell it until it loses its essence and you can't tell who the original was anymore. One could argue that that's actually why we have so many gods now, There was once a proto-god in Proto-Indo-European culture or whatever, going back far enough, that was the first one. That person's been forgotten because it was probably a person. That person's been forgotten, and over time the mythology spread around and became different gods. And as these parts are separated, the original dies and is forgotten and fades away. The new ones take its place. So all these little chopped up pieces become the new gods. Okay? And I don't know how I could tie this into Norse stuff, except maybe through Ragnarok, the idea that the gods will have their final battle and they will be destroyed, with the exception of, isn't one of them live? I forget which one.
There were several that lived, but the main gods of the pantheon died. In fact, Odin was the first to die.
Mm-hmm.
He was eaten by the Fenrir wolf.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then, of course...
who I sympathize with the most, by the way.
Then, of course, Vidar, I believe, avenged his father by ripping the wolf in two from its jaws. And then, of course, you have the battle between Thor and the Midgard serpent. Now, this is interesting because this mythology is told in two different ways.
And it's told in many cultures too, by the way.
Yes.
It's Jupiter, because we're talking Thor is Jupiter, essentially, and Zeus and Indra, and so, yes, keep going. They all fight a serpent, is what I'm getting.
In the northern mythologies, of course, Thor defeats the Midgard serpent, but then, because of the venom and the poisonous breath, he takes 9 steps away and then he dies. Now, that has ramifications to possibly be talking about how the Earth's magnetic field will be affected in this. There's a lot of things that are extraneous to just mythology. But in the story told in the Vedas, Indra, of course, fought this multi-headed serpent, but he defeated it, and he did not die.
Mm-hmm.
So you have different versions of the story, depending on the circumstances of the culture at the time, where they were at, what kind of conditions they had to face. Because the northern climes were very harsh climate. Winter was a very real threat that took a lot of lives. There was another, just as a side note, meaning to the rune Isa in the Elder Futhark, more than just ice. It also referred to the deceptive beauty of a frozen river that looked great. But it says in the Anglo-Saxon rune poem, watch out for the icy land bridge, for many fools have met their fate upon that bridge. In other words, it breaks out from underneath them and they just flow under the ice and die. And so there was a very negative aspect in terms of deception being hidden by the power of that rune. And I'm sure that in those days, there's a lot of people that thought, okay, the river's frozen over, it's cold enough, and they started walking across, wearing their shield, wearing this and that, and all of a sudden, the crackling stops underneath their feet. That's something a friend of mine, when I was first in northwestern Ontario, he used to drive those big logging trucks over frozen lakes. Okay, this man's name and risk are synonymous terms, okay? He used to say that, the crackling sound of the ice, that was a good sound because that meant that the wave was underneath you and you were okay. When that sound stopped, that meant you were in open water and you had to get out your window and out of that truck and up on top because wood floats or you were going to die there. Wow. So that's what I mean when I say, they're walking across the river with all their armor on or whatever else they had. Maybe they had a sled full of supplies and all of a sudden there's no more sound underneath them. The glittering ice bridge was a lie. And down they went.
And that's also a metaphor, not just for don't take certain chances or whatever, thinking things are good and they're not. It's also an understanding. It's sort of like in the Zen idea of this too shall pass, because even the most solid obstacle will melt away eventually or can break out from under you. So it, as much as Esau represents stagnation, freezing, stopping, blockage, blah, 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 it can also mean this too will eventually pass. This too will
Yes.
eventually be melted away, because ice is not a permanent thing, right? It does melt away. So it's an interesting. That's why it and so many others are obviously so really interesting, because in some ways it's one of the negatives when working with things like runes or tarot cards, because there's so many ways that they can be interpreted. It is not a science. One of the most foolish things that I think someone can do is to become locked to the book, as you might say, like in a tarot thing. When you read the tarot, the little booklet that comes with your tarot, and it tells you, well, this means this, and these words are blah, 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 blah. And a beginning novice tarot reader really does themselves a disservice if they become locked to the book. And this is why I actually prefer pictorial tarot cards versus just the ones that have the number on them or whatever. Give me a tarot card that has a good representation of the energy of the card. That way, when I read the card, I can look at the imagery and go by that and the symbols that are printed, like the Thoth deck for the Thoth deck, or however you want to pronounce it, that Crowley had done. For example, that's a good example of a good tarot set. Even though it's not traditional, it's good because it's filled with so much symbolism. You can look at that and you don't need words. It's just, I noticed the cup. It has something to do with emotions, I think, right? And that's actually interesting with the runes, because the runes are, of course, pictographs originally, as far as I can understand. That there's a reason Esau looks like ice, and was it Thorzos looks like a thorn, and all of these things, that because they're symbolically representative of something that would have been recognized at the time, and even now some of them are obvious, although some are less obvious today. So there's meant to be a pictorial element there that's supposed to transcend any words or any simplistic ideas. So it's meant to be scryed. You're meant to scry the cards with tarot, not read the book what they say. Sometimes if you really have no clue what the card's supposed to mean, you can look at the book or whatever. You're really supposed to look at that card and get a feel for what it means. You're supposed to scry the card. And when you're reading the bones or reading the casting of lots or reading the runes, I would assume similar things apply. It's not meant to just be, that means that, and it's some hard thing. It's meant to be felt. It's meant to be an art.
It's got to be in that feeling, that knowing, and that experiencing zone of life. Because without that, basically all you're doing is intellectualizing it. And that actually is, it's a hard left turn, so to speak, into a brick wall, far more even than the tarot, because you don't have a lot of, wonderful artwork that's involved with the runes. You just have the shape of the stave. Like, for instance, fehu or fer in the Anglo-Saxon Futhark, it's like a line with two angular lines coming out of the side. Well, that literally has the meaning of cattle.
Yep.
And so it's meant to be the horns of a bull. It means so much more than that. But that's what the picture, if you want to call it that, of the rune means. And as you move into the different aspects of the runes,
you keep talking. I'll catch up.
as the different aspects of the different runes and the different deities come into play, you begin to realize that each one builds on the other. And that, as long as you keep that I call it the diamond focus, I guess, where you realize that they are all one, and you're looking at different windows into that power, different facets, for lack of a better word, then you begin to understand how that context dignifies or undignifies the power of the rune you're trying to use. There are some runes that you do not want to use for certain purposes. In the saga, or the story of the hero Egil Skallagrimsson, who was considered one of the greatest rune masters of old, he had an experience where there was a young man that was learning how to use the runes. He was staying at the home of this lady, and this young man had given her something on whalebone to help her with her health. While she was sick, she was getting sicker, and she was getting worse. And Egil found this piece of whalebone and used one of the only ways that I have read about that can nullify a runic magical working. And that was, he took a knife and he scraped the runic inscription into a fire. And then he made another bind rune, or rune tine, they call it, gave it to the woman, and then very quickly she was feeling well and was carrying on with her life. And he made this statement: those who desire to carve runes had better first know what they are carving, because many have on a merk stave stumbled. And to give an example that many people in the scholarly side of things, and I agree with them kind of on this just from the meanings, is that this individual possibly used the rune fehu, which is, again, not just cattle, it's considered the sending rune. Okay, it grants more might and power to every rune that follows after it in an inscription. And then use the rune thursas. Well, thursas, or thurs, okay, that is the Old Norse term for giants. The giants were, many of them, the enemies of mankind. And in fact, the specific Thurs responsible for thursas, his name meant the torturer of women.
Okay.
And so somebody ignorantly possibly made a bind rune to heal a woman using the sending rune and the torturer of women.
Oh.
And whatever else went along with it.
Oh, wow.
So it kind of makes sense why, if that is what actually happened, she would have got sicker. And, some people have said, thursas represents the hammer of Thor. Well, it does if you are using it with a rune like Tyr or Tiwaz. Okay. If you're not, it isn't. And, I see women carving this rune on the front door of their house. Okay, well, think about that a little while. And, do what floats your boat, okay? I'm not here telling anybody what to do, but I'm just saying, when you know and learn that something actually may be quite maleficent towards you, you don't necessarily want to hang it around your neck and walk around.
Yeah, and that's one reason why I don't F with the runes. Like, a lot of people will be like, why don't you use runes more? I'm like, you know what? Because there's so many layers to the understanding, and there's a reason why even in the old days, everybody didn't just do it. There was people specifically that worked with runes, and they weren't just everybody. It wasn't just because everybody didn't know how to read or something. There's really a lot more to them than just what they look like. And if you don't know all these interconnecting parts, you can screw up a lot, according to what you're saying. Now, I'm one of those people, I still don't believe that the symbols themselves are anything more than just pictographs. It's what's behind them that matters. And to me, that's just how I do things. It's also from my philosophy of spirituality and magic. But for people who fully and firmly believe that the symbols themselves have power by themselves, and for good reason, I understand their reasoning, so I don't mock it or say it's wrong. It's just not my way. If that's truly where your dimension is located, then yes, you absolutely should not do them wrong. There really should be. Yes, of course, I'm sure different groups of people saw them a little differently, and you'd have two different guys doing two different, things a little differently. So there's an art there, but I'm sure there was enough overlap that they could communicate. But, to give another example, I have this set of tarot here. Now, my favorite one isn't this one. And I was looking for it. I didn't see it in my usual space. I don't use them. I just got them because I like the look of them. I never got into using them. There's actually a set of tarot that actually includes runes on them, and it uses Norse mythology for the symbolism. So it'll have Thor on it, and everybody else is taking the place of certain figures. But I just got this one. This is a new one, and it's what is it called? This, the Goetia Tarot or something. It's a newer Goetia set that I got. It's all black and white. It's pretty neat, but it'll have the cards, and instead of the traditional symbolism, which is kind of sad to me that it doesn't necessarily have, but what I do like is that it has all of the different Goetic spirits on the cards, and they're associated with the cards that supposedly they're supposed to be. I don't know who came up with that. I'm sure there's a way that they've come up with it that I'm not that much of a nerd. Again, I'm the sorcerer type. I'm a sortiaris. I'm a mystic. I'm not into being a bookworm arcanist that looks at things, and it's not all Da Vinci Code for me is what I'm getting at. So I'm not necessarily good at that part. But this is it's interesting because now when I read this card, I know Fifth of Wands is about, contest, struggle, battle, whatever. Power struggle, really. Fifth of Wands is basically power struggle. Well, who's the chief demon of this card? You have Beleth, which is not really a demon of like victory in battle or something, but is like a king of kings. He teaches kings how to be kingly. He teaches people how to be powerful. And you've got Beleth on this card for the Five of Wands. And the version of Beleth that they put, I guess they were inspired by the descriptions a little bit, but it's sort of like a centaur with wings and a crown. And it's, centaurs are traditionally got some interesting roles in mythology. I'll let you figure that out for yourself. But this image, when I look at this card, instead of reading it just like a traditional tarot card, now I've got this added dimension of pictorial element going on. And now it's associated with Beleth, and it also gives the planetary and astrological aspects of it too. So there's all these extra layers I could read into. Of course, you need to work with your cards. Same thing with your runes. You need to work with them. You need to implant in your subconscious all the different things that it could mean and know where they are in the deck, essentially. I don't think that you can access that information consciously, but subconsciously it's in your conscious when you're playing with the cards more often than should be done by, I know people say, well, they're so broadly written, any reading could make sense. That's not true, though. It's really not true. There is an art to reading them. It's meant to open your own intuition. The cards they're just slips of paper, guys. They don't do anything. But they're meant to open your intuitive process by inspiration. So it's fine that they're broad. But my point is that your subconscious somehow seems to do a very good job of picking the right card for the right situation in creepily synchronistic ways more often than we would like to admit. But of course, we have to remember the divination that we're speaking of isn't future telling. That's not what divination's ever really been for. I know that's what it's used for by charlatans. It's never really meant to be that. It is meant to be a way to, a way to distract the intellectual brain so that it shuts off for a minute and lets something else inspire the subconscious to speak through the reading of the cards. As you're scrying the cards, your mind should be empty. You're scrying the cards, and then the ideas that come to mind are your intuitive impulses. Yeah, maybe they're prescient. Prescience isn't the same thing as future reading. Prescience is a little bit different. Prescience is predicting synchronicity. It's not the same thing as saying on Tuesday I'm going to fly a kite in a thunderstorm and win $1 million. Prescience is you have a vision of money, and a few days later, it's not even that you get money. Maybe someone rewards you some other way. You get some sort of prosperity. There's a synchronistic element. It's never direct. It's always indirect. It's symbolic. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, sometimes it will be money. But if you have a vision of money, it may not be money. It may simply be you had a really productive day at work. You got a lot done. So you had a lot of prosperity happen to you. So divination's about prescience, and part of prescience, or part of divination, I should say, is knowing the self better. So people may know that, for example, one of my favorite tools to use is a pendulum. But the problem with a pendulum is it's really easy to insert egoistic desires on a pendulum. So I don't use them about something. If I'm going to do a reading with a pendulum, I better not be too conflicted or have too much of my own desire in mind. It's got to be something that is like, I'm not being honest with myself, and I have to allow my subconscious to speak through that crystal or whatever the pendulum is.
And that's so important. It's that detachment
Hmm.
Because if you're attached to the outcome, it doesn't matter what you're using as a divinatory tool, you can skew the reading
Hmm. Yep.
because your energy will be vibrating at the desire level rather than the intuitive level. And so, even if just for a moment, when you're pulling out your cards, or if you are using runes for divination, when you're casting the runes, be completely neutral.
You have to be engaged with that divine feminine, to be
Yes.
brutally honest. It's a divine feminine act. That is to say, the ego has to be the divine feminine in that moment. It has to be receptive. It has to be the womb and receive the seed of knowledge. Now, that's one thing the tarot and the runes, to a different degree, are good at, though, is if you are really attached to the outcome. While you can still influence that reading with that attachment, at least the cards give you something out of your egoistic control that will just appear in whatever order they appear. So yes, you can still screw it up by denying what they say or failing to understand.
Mm-hmm.
But at the very least, the pendulum, is you doing it. Anybody who says the pendulum moves by itself, you're superstitious and dumb. The key, like when I use a pendulum, my technique is just one I intuited myself, which was, instead of holding it out here where I see everything happening, I actually hold it so my hand is not seen. And I'm staring through the crystal. I'm not looking at it or whatever I'm using as a pendulum. I don't look at it. And I drape it over my fingers so that I am not like using my fingers to do anything. I'm just holding it steady. I get it to stabilize and I look through it. And then I ask my question. Of course, the first thing I will do is program it. I'll ask it, show me yes, show me no, show me I don't know. Whatever, and whatever my symbols are going to be, and I have it, swing the way, and it'll just do it, right? And that's my subconscious, and it's okay if a little bit of me knows that my hand's doing it. But the point is, it's up here, out of sight, out of mind. I don't look at my arm, don't look at my hand. I just study the crystal. I just study the pendulum. This way, my subconscious mind can do whatever it wants to do with the hand, and I know intellectually that it's me doing it. But I've detached that intellect from the process enough that I can just wait for it to do something and then trust what it does. It takes practice, obviously. It's not something a novice should be doing, because obviously they're the easiest one to influence. If you want it to say yes, you'll just swing it like a fool in the yes direction and say, oh, that's how the charlatans get us. But tarot doesn't give us that option. Unless you know how to stack the deck, tarot, and similarly the runes, will appear in whatever randomized order they happen to be in. And that means that if you're really screwed up, you will at least have a chance to bypass that egoism, because it will just give you whatever the cards are, and then you've got to read them. And again, the reading isn't the cards. The cards are just windows, and if those windows aren't pointing in the right direction, you're not going to see what you need to see too. If the cards are just all wrong, it won't open anything in your mind. You won't get it, and you may have to redraw. That does happen from time to time. Although I do caution people, don't draw for the same thing more than once a day unless you really know that you just screwed it up. You didn't get the answer you like, don't do it again. Give it a, depending upon the situation, you can do a daily reading, but don't do a daily reading for the exact same issue every day. Give it a week, give it a month, give it a moon, give it a fortnight. So I've noticed that we didn't really get any questions, Dan. I guess we have just been that informative. Everybody's chatting away. It's not like they're not engaged. They're complimenting and saying thank you and all this stuff, but there's not a lot of questions for you. So I usually cut these around 2 hours, but let's go for a few more minutes, give people another chance if they have a question. And what were you going to say? You sound like you took a breath. I think you're going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to say, sometimes people's questions don't come till after everything's done. I know that's the way I am. I'm sitting there, and then, half an hour after something's finished, why didn't I ask this, or why didn't I ask that? Okay, all is not lost if that happens to you, if you're watching here today. Just remember the email address that I talked about before, or the contact form on our website. Both end with tdpvideocast.ca. And realize that I'm not one of these people that just never answers folks when they send a message to me. If you have a legitimate question, I will get back to you. Okay. And that's my promise to you here.
So Wyatt keeps asking, can he be a replacement Fleshy? And I will restate again, no, you cannot be a replacement Fleshy. Fleshy is himself, and he said he might actually do a return, just a reunion tour and do a show or two now and then. So he's kind of getting through his little need for space thing, and he kind of is interested in at least coming back to the Discord and probably coming on just to say hi, calling in or something. So, but no, Wyatt, you're not going to be a Fleshy. You need to grow your own self. Wyatt's a good kid, but Wyatt also, he's definitely a look at me senpai type of guy. So he needs to get through that phase a little bit, but we'll see. Definitely check his channel out though. For his age, Wyatt is actually well beyond his years, at least in terms of knowledge. And he's just got to learn to keep that stallion reined in a little bit. And that's what he's got to do next. He's got to learn discipline and patience and all that stuff. So, yeah. Yep. All right. So I guess if there's nothing else, that's big, again, the last thing that I would want to bring up is that I think that especially in Western civilization, as we are going off this cliff of, the Great Reset and all this other nonsense that's going on, even if we are going to become, go through the technological singularity, that may be inevitable, right? But if we don't maintain more of that divine masculine, and I think that part of that is in the essence of the ancient, European spirituality. It's in there. We look at movies like The Northman, which of course are really big dramatizations, and of course they're really romanticized, and it probably wasn't anything like that. But that energy, there's a reason people want to see that. They're thirsty for it because it's being denied of them. They're not allowed to have. And in that movie, it was great because you had this perfect representation of the divine masculine and feminine in the two main characters that were interacting in a way. It was like, whoa, this is perfect. They're both powerful, beautiful, strong, incredible creatures in their journey. And it's great to see for once, instead of, the man sucks or the woman sucks or whatever. Everybody was this powerful individual. And we need that. We need to be able, it's not just pride. It's not this, it gets perverted into racial pride, into this and culture pride. You do have to have a little pride, but I'm talking about, it gets perverted into when something is deprived long enough, what happens? There's always a pendulum swing back the other way, and it gets too much, right? So if you get somebody who, for example, I had a friend whose mother wouldn't let him have anything dangerous in his life. She was really overprotective, couldn't touch kitchen knives. So he comes over to my house where I've got guns and swords and knives, and I couldn't trust him with it because he got his hands on a knife and immediately just started stabbing them. I'm like, what are you doing? He's like, I don't know. I just felt like I had to. I'm like, you are insane because you've never had this experience. So of course it ran away from him. So what happens when you pressure people into being weak and ashamed of themselves? Of course, the next thing that happens is they're going to overcompensate. So we've got to reinsert some pride into, and I mean this for all cultures, by the way. I don't care if you're from Africa or in India or whatever. You absolutely, but I don't think that at least, here we have that problem where you're not allowed to do that. There's only one group of people in this country that seems to be, you're not allowed to be proud of yourself anymore. And it's men, and it's, let's just say it, So we need to, as a culture, and I'm not saying it belongs to only us. If you happen to be of African ancestry and you want to practice Norse mythology, I support you. I'm part Norse. I give you permission. You don't need my permission. Practice it. If you feel a calling from those as your ancestors, then they're your spiritual ancestor too. I know there's going to be some white power fools that are going to get mad at me for saying that, but fuck them. Let them curse me. I'll laugh it off.
Oh, they don't have any power anyway.
No.
People that do that sort of thing, they forget the fact that consciousness is everything. Okay? Everything. And anytime there is this, I am better than thee.
Oh boy, yep.
For any reason, okay, this does not mean that you then disqualify your achievements. But what I'm talking about here is if this whole business of who is the greatest, okay, that is the immaturity of consciousness, okay, in the egoic sense of the word. All right, when you get knocked around in life long enough, you realize that consciousness just is, and you accept that. and you work with that, because it's not something that you have power over. You see, that is what gives you life.
Mm-hmm.
That is what gives you your experience of existence and to have an egoic mind to experience things in the first place. Okay? And so flow with it rather than fight against it. They had the saying in the Northern tradition too, do not fight against your weird, work with it.
Go with the flow, Wu Wei.
With the flow, exactly.
With the Tao, right?
Because you'll never win. Even the gods could not win against weird.
Mm-hmm. And so, like I'm saying, and it sucks that one of the things that I catch myself on, this is shadow work, by the way. I'm doing shadow work live on air. I catch myself doing what I just said about, it doesn't matter if you're from Africa or whatever. That's because there's a shadow in me going, are people going to think we're racist? Are people going to think we're this? And then I realize, why did they think that? Well, it's because some other asshole has decided that anybody who's proud of their ancestry that doesn't happen to be something other than white is a racist. And so there's this stupid shadow going on here where we can't talk about this with reverence and joy and share it with the world. We've got to put, disclaimers around something that shouldn't have a disclaimer around it. We shouldn't have to say that. And I catch myself saying it going, man, I wish I didn't have to say that. I wish I could just, but there's so many fools running rampant right now that I'm not trying to make it sound like a victim thing, like it's only happening to white people or whatever. I don't mean that either. But there's so many fools that will take everything we're saying and try to spin it into something that benefits them by calling us names or saying this and that. I get this a lot in my life because I've always been an outsider in a lot of ways. I've always been a heretic because I never conform to any group that I find myself in. If I go to a Zen temple or something, I sit there and I can hold this conversation with them and wow them. And at the same time, they go, well, that's not our way. I'll become a heretic very quickly, even though I understand what they do very well. I could go to, again, a Norse thing. It's not, I don't know as much about it, but I can obviously hold a conversation with someone who does. But I'd be a heretic in the very strict interpretation of Norse mythology and magic. I'm used to being a heretic. I'm used to being an outcast. I'm used to being made fun of for the way I look, act, speak, and do things. But most other people, for whatever reason, they're very easily made ashamed. And that's another thing that's got to stop. So when I say I give you permission, that was from a place of shame, not a place of assertive, masculinity. That wasn't from a place of, power. That was actually from a place of weakness. So I don't take it back, but I'm admitting that live shadow work on air. I wasn't in my power when I said that. That was in a place of weakness that I said that. And worry. Well, I rebuke that. I don't allow that to be the reason. I'm saying that in a way that is assertive now. I give you not permission. I encourage you. I am telling you, go out there right now and enjoy these things and work with them. And don't put any spiritual path off of your menu. Have respect. If someone's like, oh, it's a closed system, you don't have to go in their face and say, no, it's not. Do as thou wilt. That's the divine. That's a metaphor for the divine, the Tao, the weird again. Do as thou wilt. You don't have to be a dick about it, but do as thou wilt. And that's it. So
well said. Well said, Beatrice.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you.
And that's so important because there are people out there that take the symbols of the Northern tradition, not all of them, but certain ones, and pervert them into different meanings that they never had. And then that changes it in the minds
as
of people.
Wyatt brought up, he brought up the buffalo thing. I don't want to talk about the buffalo thing too much.
No.
But because I don't want to give any attention to that stuff for three reasons. One, I think it's a glowy op. Two, I think it makes serial murderers, more famous. I don't like to do that. But the fact that there's so much of that stuff in there, using the black sun, and then the media is trying to tell you what that even means. They have no clue what that symbol is supposed to mean. Anyway. But go ahead. Sorry, Dan.
Oh, no, it's all. Excuse me. Very dry here today. Strange since it rained all day. But the thing is that, when we just stop listening to the narratives that other people are putting out, regardless of whether it's about magic, whether it's about Northern European magic, whether it's about what your life is day to day, the narratives that those that like to think themselves to be in power want to impose upon people. You have to accept that in order for it to work in your life. It doesn't mean that it won't be challenging, but you can reject the narrative and choose to be free. Okay? And I would rather be free and be going through challenges. Be a
I'd rather
slave.
face the danger. I'd rather face the danger.
You know, yes, exactly, because that's actually where we begin to understand the whole Maya concept and the illusion that's there, because what these narratives are putting forward is definitely not absolute truth by any stretch of the word, especially since, you know, we really don't understand what truth with a capital T is anyway in the egoic sense. We can only touch on it here and there. But that can be touched upon through any and all different magical systems that exist in the world. And even in those aspects that are not, you know, from formal traditions, even chaos magic, that can touch upon that truth with a capital T enough to cause a revolutionary transformation in your life, in your experience, in the way that you move forward in the world. And really, when it comes down to it, being able to make that revolutionary experience a part of your day-to-day, to make that a part of what you are bringing to the table for your family, what you are bringing to the table for your community. That's how you become remembered. That's how you become something more than what you were, which was the quest of life, and is the quest of life in an evolutionary context. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, if that's something that's a burning thing in your heart, you know, and you want to take a look at what the runes are all about, go for it. Mm-hmm. If you want to take a look at things through voodoo, go for it. Look at it. See what's there. Look what's behind the masks. Whether you're working with gods, angels, demons, look behind the mask. Don't be content just with what is on the surface, because there's so much more, and the actual truth of becoming is found in the depths, not on the surface.
I'm going to make a comment on something somebody commented here. You know, the Neon Cicada said, there is a white supremacist alt-right subculture within European pagan groups. Now, yes, I'm going to be a little bit rude, not to you. I'm going to be rude to the attack the idea, not the person, because I don't think Neon Cicada is a bad person at all, by the way. So if this comes out wrong, it's not directed at you, my friends. But I want to attack that idea head on. My first impulse is to say, yeah, well, of course. But what I also want to say is we wouldn't know about that if there wasn't someone highlighting it. Now, yes, these people that have this mentality, they draw attention to themselves. Of course they do. But they are quite a tiny minority in our civilization. And the principles of Norse mythology and paganism are threaded throughout Western culture. From Christmas to Easter to everything else, there's elements of, you know, pagan European culture embedded everywhere. Okay, whether we see it and do it consciously or not, it's in it. So these people who are the racist ones, I don't think that they're a majority at all. I think that they're a very tiny minority of people who practice these things intentionally. I'm sure they exist, and I'm sure a lot of them are prideful. Like, I make a distinction between racism and a little bit of pride, like saying, like, I'm proud to be Irish and Italian and Scottish and French and German. I'm proud to be all those things. That means I'm proud to be not white per se, but those are all white, aren't they? You know, for the most part. So some of them are a little brown. You know, I have Cyprus in me. If you go back to my genealogy, that some of me comes from, you know, what would have been brown people too. But so it's not about whiteness. It's just about the cultures that I come from. I'm very proud of all of them. And so to have some pride in that, there's nothing negative about that. As long as you're not doing the I'm better than you thing, mm-hmm. there's nothing wrong with that. I'm proud of the food that I cook. Does that mean I'm a better cook than you? No, just proud of what I cook. Neon says I'm an awful person. All right, maybe you are. I don't know. You seem like a nice person. Huh? But getting back to what I'm saying is, so you wouldn't know about these people if certain other people didn't highlight it to create a boogeyman, a straw man that they can attack and make you scared of and hesitant to be proud of yourself about. This is what I was getting at before with when I said what I said, it was from a place of weakness, not strength. I wasn't coming from a place where I was pridefully saying, enjoy this too. It was from a, people are going to think I'm a racist. I better cover it up with some kind of platitude. That's a weakness. And it's inspired by the same thing that made you bring that out and say there are these extreme people. Now, I also take issue with the whole, right-wing thing. Like, that's a right-wing thing. There's left-wing nationalists too, believe it or not. It's a different kind of thing. They do exist, okay? There's left-wing racists. We know this. This is obvious. In fact, on the left, the racism that's most prevalent is the racism of low expectations, right? So on the right, you would say that the racism would be we look down and we say that, which I don't live that way. I don't know many people who do. But my point is that these things are not exclusive to one side or more prevalent to one side or the other, nor is any of them. Look, how many socialists, left-wing socialists, are Nazis? Isn't it in the name Nazi? And how, what? This is not limited to right wing. There's also left wing versions of these things. So this idea that it's a right wing thing is asinine. It's the Azov Battalion's not, I probably shouldn't even say that thing on YouTube. I could get freaking shadow banned. They're not. Anyway, I'll just leave it at that. So this idea that this idea that we have to, be worried here. It's not because there's anything wrong with what we're doing. It's that they want to highlight the bad people so that they make normal people afraid to practice these things, look at these things, be proud of themselves. It's a chilling effect. Because how many people do I know that I wonder if I put a thing of runes up or the black sun or anything, are they going to go, oh, this guy must be a racist? Look at what happened. I sent Dan today. I sent him the link to this stream. And I posted this link in several groups. And one person commented on it with what was obviously a highly racist comment. Right? I didn't respond to it. But I noted it. Because I knew the moment that I come out talking about this, somebody out there is going to say, oh, look, white people being racist with their Norse this and their white people that, and that's on them. That's not on us. And it's time we stop letting them dictate what's okay. This brings up that argument of like the swastika and all this other stuff, which, it's not a symbol that belongs to me. I don't use it for anything. I'm not interested in using it. I don't care. It's not like I'm mad that I can't or shouldn't. And if I was, I'd probably use it more from the Buddhist symbolism that other version of it. I'd probably be more interested to use it for that, not for some Nordic reason or whatever. But, it's like that tear song, talking about that. Like, we need to take that symbol back and make it mean what it originally meant again, not a symbol of Nazism or something. And it sucks because I have Jewish friends that they're like, well, you shouldn't use it because. Like, well, how would you feel if you couldn't use the Star of David for something? And I can hear it now. So, oh, you're being anti-Semitic right now. No, I'm not. I'm just asking a question. How would it be if I said you couldn't use the Star of David because it might offend somebody? It's the same question. I didn't put anybody, through the Holocaust. I would fight against that. Mm-hmm. So why am I blamed for it? Why can't? So this is mind control tactics. This is how they get us in all of these dimensions. And again, you don't have to be a dick. Don't be a dick about it. If be respectful of people around you. Be sensitive to them. I'm not saying be a dick and flaunt it at people. Look, I got a swastika and blah, blah, blah. Don't be a dick, okay? But stop coming from a place of weakness and stop letting people dictate to you what you're allowed to do based on stuff like that. Have compassion. Compassion's easy. Compassion's the easiest thing in the world. Morality is hard and morality sucks. Compassion's easy. If you have compassion, then you can generally navigate life in a way that moralists will appreciate and people who aren't moralists will appreciate too. You have a much easier time getting away with things because people can sense you're coming from a place of compassionate intent. I have a compassionate intent. I am not going to come at somebody and attack them for their beliefs. I just want to be left alone. Can we all do that? Can we all do that, I think? I think so. I think if we just put our minds to it and assert a compassionate air of I'm going to be me and I'm not going to try to make you somebody else, I think it'll stick. I think more people have to, growing up as someone who was picked on a lot, I guess I grew a thick enough skin where, yes, it still bothers me when I can tell somebody doesn't like me, right? But I've also developed ways to deal with it. A lot of people haven't. And they'll let someone making fun of them stop them from being themselves. Me, if it hurts me, I do it anyway. I face tank it and I go through it and I just deal with it. I endure it. A lot of people don't know how to do that. So it's difficult to insult me into changing. It's very difficult. And you should be like that too. Don't let people insult you into changing. So I think we can do this. I think that people can, when someone mocks you for something that's really not wrong, ignore them. I just went through 5 years, 6 years, 7 years of people who were my best friends saying people like me were Nazis because I voted for Trump. And I'm not a Nazi in the slightest. I hate racism. I hate bigotry. I hate all that shit. I don't like it. It's not me. They know this. They know my history. They know what I've done to protect people from actual racists and bigots in my life. And yet they had the audacity to say, anybody who voted for him, you're a Nazi and don't be my friend. So I said, fine, I see where I stand. I've been called a Nazi for 5 years without being one, to the point where I don't care about the term anymore. People go, he's a Nazi bigot. I go, whatever, shut up. You're just using a term that you think has impact and it doesn't anymore. It's lost meaning, unfortunately. So the actual Nazis, nobody cares about them either anymore. It's like, now we can't, it's okay, fine. We're all bad now. We're all bad. So we can do better. I think we can all do better. We can hold our heads high again, because the thing about insults is after a while they lose energy. The thing about all this, they lose energy. Just like any crisis, they have a half-life. And I think that we can get out there, and I think that we can be compassionate. And I think that's part of the Great Awakening, that transcends any spiritual movement, whichever one you're in. The compassion is awakening in humanity. And we're looking at each other, even if we're mad, that's like a righteous anger, but there's still a compassion there. I'm looking at people and I'm going, these people completely suck. I hate what they're doing. And I pity them. So whatever I'm going to do, I'm going to try to be as merciful about it as possible and just try to keep the peace as long as I can. As long as there's peace, there's a chance for people to change. Mm-hmm. So let's try that. Right. So, yeah. Yeah, and Audacity says Native Americans used it too, the swastika. Everybody used that symbol for something,
Yeah, why is basically the sun wheel.
Yeah, and it's found everywhere. And it yeah. So anyway, I again, now I think I'm still talking from a place of weakness, but I'm trying to bring forth just this mood change. Stop letting people shame you into not being you. There's nothing to be ashamed here of at all. Laugh at people who would mock you for this. If you're interested in this spirituality, black, brown, white, woman, Asian, whatever, doesn't matter. If you're interested in this type of spirituality, pursue it. And you can always come to someone. I'm sure, Dan, you obviously are open. If it doesn't matter, you're not going to turn somebody away because they're from a non-Caucasian ancestry.
Of course not. Of course not.
So if you're interested in this and you want to learn it, go to Dan. And he will guide you. I am sure of it. So that's how we roll. And I'm sure we get our haters because of that. I'm sure they're out there. So
well, whatever.
Whatever. What are you gonna do, right? So all right, I'll let you have the last word if you got any. And I think we're gonna close it up here now. But once again, go to Dan's channel. And of course, if you like my work, support it. Buy my crap. Go to my Etsy. Go to my Patreon. Buy my books, give me some love. And if you like Dan's work, check him out. So, and Behemoth X showed up at the end. Behemoth, you got to come here like an hour or two ago. Thank you, Behemoth X. I'm glad to see you, brother. I'm glad you got your channel situation fixed. Screw that lady for stealing your stuff. That's completely bogus, but I'm glad that you got them taken down for it. I don't know if people know, but someone was ripping off Behemoth X videos to use as a background for them blabbing away So he got them taken down. So yeah,
Oh,
it's all over. Good job, Behemoth,
good.
bro. Thank you, man.
Yeah.
So, all right.
Well, the only thing that I would put in at the end here is just to be true to yourself. But in order to be true to yourself, regardless of what system you're looking at in magic, is you need to know yourself. Now that sounds trite because, you know, that was the inscription over the temple at Delphi, know thyself. But seriously take that as your modus operandi. Do not be
Which self,
afraid
though?
of what you
Which
see.
self, though? The ego self or the true
Well,
self?
all of it, because you know what?
Wow.
You're the ego too.
Yeah, well, the ego is definitely something you do anyway.
The thing is, though, is that, you know, you're going to see things when you actually want to look at yourself honestly that are things you might not want to see or hear or know.
Yeah.
But don't be afraid of that. Don't shrink back from that.
That's the
Just
shadow work.
release judgment.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's only when you begin to see things as they are that you can do anything to transform yourself. If you put up walls of, okay, I'm not going to acknowledge that, it will always eat at you. Just allow yourself. And this is the hardest thing. You know, a lot of times people say, you know, oh, the discipline, that's the hardest thing. No, it isn't. That's just getting into a routine. Okay, but it is allowing yourself to unite with who you really are in an ongoing basis. That is the hardest thing. Because the egoic mind, the personality of who we think we are in this world, loves to swell with its own sense of importance. But it's nothing but a shadow.
Mm.
And when you allow yourself to be authentic, like what DH and I were talking about on the TDP just on Sunday, I believe it was, you see, it brings about a whole series of events that launch you into a transformation. And that's where you find freedom. That's where you find power that doesn't just dissipate. That's where you find what is actually going to move you to ascension, if that's what you're going to talk about, or apotheosis, a well overused term. It is all about allowing yourself to be who you really are and be more of that than you are just of the egoic expression. So I want to encourage you, do not give up, keep on going. This is one of the biggest things the Northern tradition will teach you if you decide to go into that, and that is to never give up. You are not finished until you lie down and don't get up.
I just made a post about being a doomer the other day on Twitter because there's a lot, not to get political about it, but in the current arena of world events, there's a lot of people who look at this with a pessimistic, black-pilled attitude that we can't win this. And they say, "Oh, it's not going to be," and they drag everybody down with their lack of morale. And it's like, even if we're going to lose, you know, I guess I've had more fist fights and fights than most people. Even if you're going to lose, keep swinging. Like, how dare you, like, stop fighting? It's shut up, keep going. Like you said, until you're done, keep going. Don't give up. Even if you're going to lose, that's the only way you might win. The minute you give up is when you lose. You don't lose until you give up. Whether it's your body giving up or your will giving up, it's basically the same thing. If don't give up. Even if you're losing, don't fight to the end and fight for the honor of the fight. Then if you can't win the fight, keep going. The only time that you can retreat, that's part of fighting too. Retreating and surrendering can be part of the fight too. But the point is, don't give up. You can surrender and not give up.
Go down swinging, guess what? You'll be remembered.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the immortality in the Northern tradition there too.
And if you have to, be a snake in the grass. submit and then stab them in the back after they've made you a slave. You know, you don't have to go at them head on. I'm different though. I'm a left-hand path guy. I don't believe. But that's the point though, is don't give up. Even if you're losing, don't give up. You know, this applies to martial arts. It applies to business. It applies to politics. It applies to love. Yes, I'm not saying, you know, make someone love you and don't give up. I'm saying don't give up on loving someone, right? It's one thing if they don't love you, and you have to have your boundaries, but you can say, I'm never going to be with this person, either because it's your choice or theirs, but still have love for them. It's possible. So don't give up on something that's established, and don't give up on your battles. Don't give up on what matters. And I love that you said that. Don't give up. Yes.
Well, thank you very much for having me on, DH.
You're welcome. And by the way, we're both named Dan. You know that, but I don't think everybody else knows that. My first name is Daniel. I call myself DH because I'm one of those pretentious author guys. But Daniel Hannibal Thorne. And I have people who go, "Is that your real name?" Just one of them. Yeah. So we should call the next time we do this D squared, and we'll have a D squared cast at some point. But no, thank you for coming on. I always love hearing your voice, and you know, you have one of those voices that if I ever did a movie, I'd want you to narrate at least part of it. You know, so I think that would be really cool. But you know what I should do? If I ever write a book that would be worthy of someone doing an audio book, I should throw you some money and have you do the audio book for me. I think that would really be cool. And have I wish I could afford that. It would be so much fun. I don't know what your price would be, but I wish I could afford it, because that would be really cool to have someone like you narrate one of my books if I ever did that. So absolutely.
Well, I'll bear that in mind.
Okay. All right, guys. So again, make sure you look for his channel, and until next time, mind the shadows, and give us your closing slogan there, Dan, if you got one.
Be watching the mysteries and peel back the layers.
I like that too. Good night, everybody.
Good night.